Chapter 705. Yesterday, I wrote the Tang's second master as the Shui's second master. Recently, my physical and mental strength truly have reached a certain level. I tried to change it, but because this is the new edition of the author's section, I don't know how to use it, so I don't know if I succeeded or not. It's still the same sentence. Recently, my physical and mental strength. Okay, just now I confirmed that the change was successful. Wang Po understood. They wanted to kill Zhou Tong. They wanted to kill him and Chen Chongqing. The Wenshui Tang's choice had been based on their different attitudes towards him and Chen Chongqing, resulting in some deviation. But there were still two things that he did not understand. If the Tang clan was purely a merchant, putting profit above all else, then why did the Tang clan want Chen Chongqing dead? Everyone knew that Chen Chongqing and Tang were close friends. If he succeeded as Pope, it would be of enormous benefit to the Tang clan. White Emperor City also does not agree to Chen Chongqing succeeding as Pope. This is also a question that many people do not understand. The Tang's second master explained, that is because White Emperor City has a better choice, and to my Tang clan, Chen Chongqing is admittedly the best choice, but to me, he is the worst choice. The one on good terms with Chen Chongqing was Tang, not the Wenshui Tangs, and certainly not the Tang's second master. Wang Po asked, this being the case, why would the old master listen to you? The Tang's second master replied, you know that the old master dislikes the divine empress the most. The things Chen Chongqing does make the old master extremely unhappy. At this moment, the clear cry of a sword came from the snowstorm at the end of the street, and then there was the glow of a sword. Chen Chongqing's figure was faintly discernible in the snowstorm. With a groan, the stench of blood penetrated the snowstorm and arrived at this place. The battle had already begun, but Wang Po's blade remained unmoved on the table. His gaze retracted from the distance and fell upon the snow-covered blade. You can't even wait 10 some days? The entire continent knew that the Pope's illness was getting worse and worse. With the arrival of autumn and the arrival of winter, with the arrival of the season, it was already the last 10 some days. The great Zhou imperial court, White Emperor City, and the Wenshui Tangs, even if they wanted to seize the position of Pope, why couldn't they wait 10 some days? His Holiness the Pope is a saint. At the moment of his death, lightning will assuredly follow him, and he will make arrangements. The Tang's second master said, what we need to do is disrupt his plans and use the simplest method to resolve the most complicated problems in the future. Even if the Pope returned to the Sea of Stars and the entire world knew of his arrangements, who would dare oppose him? Once the orthodoxy was united in will, even someone as strong as Shang Xingzhou or as scheming as the Wenshui Tangs would find it very difficult to drive Chen Chongqing out of the Li Palace. Killing Chen Chongqing ahead of time would definitely be countless times simpler than waiting for him to sit on the seat of Pope. From the looks of it, this was the most correct solution, but before this solution appeared, no one would have thought of this. No one could have imagined that just before the Pope was about to leave this world, not only would Shang Xingzhou not have the patience to wait, he would insist on acting before he left this world. Whose decision was this? Wang Po asked the Tang's second master. Master. Tang master, have I young master? Master said, Master, Master said. Wang Po looked into his eyes and said, after so many years, you still like to play these tricks. Correct, because this is the only thing I'm good at, the Tang's second master said, his smile fading. Many years ago, the current principal of the Heavenly Tao Academy, Zhuang Zhihuan, had seen him in Wenshui. From then until now, Zhuang Zhihuan had always marveled at his talent in cultivation, marveled even more at how he would waste it. In the entire world, only the Tang old master understood why he cared so little for his precious talent in cultivation, casting it aside like a pair of worn-out shoes. Because no matter how high his talent in cultivation was, it could never surpass Wang Po. No matter how diligently he cultivated, he could never surpass Wang Po. Many years ago, he had reluctantly and despairingly recognized this fact. Thus, the once promising Tang's second master had become a hedonistic hedonist of Wenshui City, gradually becoming nameless. No one knew that he had only given up on cultivation. He had always been silently working hard in other areas. He was well aware that only in this way could he defeat Wang Pu. Like wisdom, strategy, callous schemes, and his ability to judge and exploit the human heart. In terms of fighting, I might never be able to match you in this lifetime. But in terms of other areas, you're not even worthy of carrying my shoes. I know best what every person cares about, what they want, what thresholds they can't cross, what shadows they can't see. Everyone says that Wang Po's path of the blade is straight. To seek fame and sell straightforwardness, what you care about the most is naturally your reputation. Today, I will use the reputation you want to press down on your blade. What can you do about it? The Tang's second master looked at Wang Pu and laughed. Just like usual, his mouth was open, but no sound could be heard. Every word that had come out of his mouth had been mocking and ridiculing Wang Pu. As Wang Pu looked at his face, his desire, his impulse, grew stronger and stronger. But what could he do? He was not a person who sought fame and sold straightforwardness. But his kindness was as weighty as a mountain. If this mountain pressed down, could he really hack it down with one strike? Madame Mu walked out of the hall and raised her head to the sky. Snow was falling from the sky, coming from the clouds. No matter how others looked at it, in her eyes, the snow and the clouds were sheep, white and soft. Wherever her gaze passed, the snow drifted and the clouds moved like a flock of sheep. Mao Chuyu's expression turned abnormally grave at this sight, his sleeves fluttering in the still air. She drew back her gaze and looked to the side of the hall, revealing a cold smile as she asked, "My younger sister was punished here?" Besides the demi-human empress, she also had the identity of the great Western continent's chief princess. Her younger sister was once a prefect of the orthodoxy, Mu Jiushi. Shang Xingzhou's desire to expel Chen Chongxing from the orthodoxy and push for Mu Jiushi to become the successor to the Pope naturally had a great deal to do with her. Upon hearing this, Mao Chuyu's expression actually calmed down and he lightly waved his sleeve. A gust of wind swept up the snow in front of the hall, sweeping it into the shadows of the halls and revealing several figures. Daoist Baisher, Linghai Jiwang, and Lin. Daoist Siyuan. The 5 strongest prefects of the orthodoxy were all present. And this was the Li Palace. Even if she was a saint, she was not necessarily invincible. And this wasn't even considering the fact that although the Pope was gravely ill, he was still the Pope. Mao Chuyu sternly asked, "Empress, does Empress truly wish to make an enemy of my orthodoxy? To disagree with Yin is to make an enemy of the orthodoxy?" She calmly asked, "Is Shang not allowed to represent the orthodoxy?" Mao Chuyu, Linghai Jiwang, and the others did not change their expressions, but their Dao hearts were thoroughly chilled. They knew that if they did not handle this matter properly today, the orthodoxy was highly likely to welcome its greatest internal conflict since the Holy Maiden's departure to the south. Shang Xingzhou was also a legitimate successor of the orthodoxy, and also the Pope's senior brother. 1,000 years ago, he had lived in the Li Palace. From a certain perspective, after the Pope's death, he was the person that could best represent the orthodoxy. The meaning of Madame Mu's words was crystal clear. The Li Palace suddenly experienced a blizzard. The snowstorm in the imperial palace suddenly became more violent. The western wind swept up bits of snow, slapping against the door to the side of the hall. The door was pushed open, but the blizzard could not enter, because Shang Xingzhou had walked out. In order to subdue the pavilion of heavenly secrets and help His Majesty stabilize the court in the shortest time possible, he had stayed in this room for many days. Today he walked out. He was prepared to leave the palace. He wanted to go to the Li Palace. Some Taoists of profound cultivation walked out of the blizzard and followed behind him. Chapter 706. Shang Xingzhou did not leave the imperial palace. His will was like a torrential flood, about to cover the entire capital and even the entire world, swallowing Qin Changsheng without a trace. At this moment, someone stood up. The Pope was still in the Li Palace, Wang Po was still by the table, Su Yorong was in South Stream Temple. The girls of South Stream Temple had been stopped by Priest Xian and his men in the Orthodox Academy, Tang 36 was in Wenshui, and Zhixiu had disappeared. The person who stood out was out of everyone's expectations, but when they thought about it carefully, it was only natural. Yuren stood in the snow, eunuchs and palace maids kneeling around him. For the first time, the young emperor went against the wishes of his teachers and ministers and appeared somewhere between heaven and earth. That was the position he had chosen for himself. The cold wind ruffled his cloak, but it couldn't ruffle his eyebrows and eyes. His expression was still calm and tranquil. No matter how angry the wind and snow were, it was only natural. He looked at his teacher quietly. Shang Xingzhou looked at him quietly. Unlike Qin Changsheng, Yuren was Shang Xingzhou's true successor, Shang Xingzhou's lifelong dream entrusted to him. Shang Xingzhou really loved him dearly and was willing to do anything for him. Everything he did was for his own benefit. Yuren was well aware of this, so he was moved, then uneasy, then fearful. These days, he had been learning how to be a wise monarch in the palace. He was silent and fearful. He knew that his teacher would definitely kill his junior brother. If he wanted to become an eternal monarch like Emperor Taizong, there could not be a single flaw in his heart. In other words, there could not be any existence in the world that could shake his will. This was what Shang Xingzhou wanted to ensure. He would not even allow himself to have such influence. Qin Changsheng could do this, so he must die. No one understood. The great Western continent did not understand, White Emperor City did not understand, Wenshui did not understand, the South did not understand, and the Pope did not understand. Only that old temple next to Xining village understood. On that morning in the Mausoleum of Books, Yuren had watched his junior brother carry the Tianhai Divine Empress's body down the mountain, watched his master walk up the mountain, watched them brush past each other like strangers, and understood. So these days, he was very obedient in the palace, diligently learning how to be a wise ruler. The more uneasy and fearful he was, the more obedient and quiet he was, just like he was in Xining village's old temple. However, Master still wanted to kill junior brother. In that case, he could only stand out and tell his master that this wouldn't do. As he gazed at Yuren in the snowstorm, Shang Xingzhou's expression grew colder and colder, his will to kill Qin Changsheng even firmer. He had wanted Qin Changsheng dead precisely because of this, and Yuren's appearance was proof of his thoughts. In his view, Qin Changsheng deserved to die even more. How could they stop all of this? How could they change the mind of someone like Shang Xingzhou? Yuren's hand gripped a jade pendant tied to his belt. This jade pendant was made of green jade. Its entire body was translucent, without the slightest impurity. It was extremely valuable. This jade pendant had no fluctuations of qi, so it was not a magical artifact. It was merely a gift that the Qiushan clan head had presented to the new monarch when he had entered the palace a few days ago. This gift was to the liking of the new emperor. When Yuren had received the jade pendant in the hall, he had not shown any strange expression, but his mind had been slightly disturbed. He didn't expect that there would be someone in the world who could guess his worries and uneasiness and even give him a solution. He was keenly aware that during the chaos of Mount Li, that Qiushan Jun, who was equally famous as his junior brother, had faced his father and done something. So when he faced his master, perhaps he could also do the same thing. Shang Xingzhou's gaze pierced through the snow and rested on the jade pendant in Yuren's hand. He knew everything that happened in the palace, so he naturally knew the origins of this jade pendant. He understood what Yuren wanted to express, so he fell silent. The snow continued to fall, and the accumulated snow in the plaza of the imperial palace gradually deepened. The kneeling eunuchs, maids, and tensome Taoists were like black dot. After some time, Shang Xingzhou finally spoke. "Just this once." He looked at Yuren and said, "Just this once." Yuren very seriously nodded his head. Shang Xingzhou continued, "But Your Majesty, you must understand that this is the capital, not Xining Village's old temple. This is a matter of the world, not a matter between us three master and disciple. This is not because he forgot to boil water, cook, or clean. If you want to take his place, you can take it. I cannot punish him, but there are other people who will act for the heavens, and he will still die." Yuren did not think so. He knew that Madame Mu had gone to the Li Palace, that a supreme expert like Tai Shu was standing guard outside Zhou prison, and that there was also Xiao De, Xiao Zhang, and even the Wenshui Tangs. But he still believed in Chen Chongqing. Because Chen Chongqing was not alone. He had companions. Yuren was well aware that, under his influence, his junior brother did not speak much, nor could he be said to be interesting. But in Xining Village, whether he went hunting in the mountains, caught fish in the streams, or went to town to buy vegetables, he would always encounter people who were willing to help him. Those people were hunters, fishermen, all of them people with good intentions. Perhaps it was because the two of them had always had an indelible kindness to this world? The sounds of fighting on the street suddenly vanished. This did not mean that the battle was over, because it was clear in the snow that Chen Chongqing was still standing. Wang Po's fingers were very slender and very steady, especially when he gripped the hilt of his blade. The thin layer of snow fell away, revealing the true appearance of the blade. It was still sheathed, not showing its edge. But there was already a massive difference. Previously, this blade had been quietly placed on the table, but now it was grasped in his hand. With his actions, many things had changed. The Tang's second master's complexion turned abnormally nasty. A hint of surprise flashed through Tai Shu's eyes. The Wenshui Tangs had used the words kindness as weighty as a mountain, but it still could not make this person withdraw his blade? Could it be that you dare to attack me? The Tang's second master stared into Wang Po's eyes, his voice even colder than the snow. He represented the Wenshui Tangs, represented the old master, represented that mountain. Wang Po stood up and said to him, "I will not attack you." The Tang's second master said nothing, knowing that there was more to come. As expected. "Because you are not worthy," Wang Po replied. From Tanja Temple to the snowy street, from the yellow leaves to the snowstorm, in the days since Wang Po had arrived in the capital, his blade had never been sheathed. Everyone knew that he was comprehending the path of the blade, nurturing his edge. His blade was certain to shake the heavens and the earth. Besides an expert of the divine domain, who had the right to endure this blade. When Wang Po said that the Tang's second master was not worthy of this blade, he was not mocking him, but speaking the truth. The truth was the most hurtful. The Tang's second master's complexion turned even nastier, but then he began to laugh. This time there was a sound to his laughter. He roared with laughter, brimming with derision. His laughter suddenly stopped as he stared at Wang Po and coldly said, "Whether you are not worthy or you do not dare, if you do not use your blade, you will never be able to resolve today's predicament." This was also the truth. If Wang Po did not use his blade, how could he help Chen Chongqing? What happened next was Wang Po's answer. He gripped his blade and swung it at the Tang's second master. It was like a wave of a sleeve, like brushing away dust, like driving away something disgusting from one's eyes. His movement was very light and disdainful. The Tang's second master's pupils constricted. He had not expected that Chen Chongqing would actually attack him. Circulating his true essence, he stepped on the snow, transforming into several golden blurs that dodged in all directions. In the last few years, he had not been as diligent in his cultivation as he had been in the past, but he still possessed astonishing talent and was a direct descendant of the Tang clan. His strength still existed, and his cultivation was rather high. He used the myriad golden leaves movement technique of the Wenshui Tangs. In a flash, one could reach the other shore. This was a supreme technique that not even Tang 36 had been able to learn. Although it was not as marvelous as the Yesher step, it was still very difficult to see through. Countless fragments of snow flew as Wang Po's blade descended. The iron saber simply fell, but it contained endless changes. In the end, nothing changed. The blade drew out a straight line in the wind and snow, simple and clear. The front of the line accurately struck one of the blurs in the golden light. There was a crisp slap, like the sound of a slap to the face. The Tang's second master heavily fell onto the snowy street. The right side of his face was red and swollen, blood seeping from the corner of his lips, and his eyes brimming with disbelief. After a few moments, he came to his senses and furiously yelled at Wang Po, "You actually dared to hit me!" Wang Po looked back at him, saying nothing. Several teeth mixed with blood were spat out of the Tang's second master's mouth. He used a trembling finger to touch his face. Even more furious, he shrieked, "You actually dared to hit my face! When I first saw you in Wenshui, I already wanted to hit you." Wang Po paused for a moment, then continued, "And I especially wanted to hit your face." Chapter 707. The Tang's second master had a handsome face, but when he habitually gave a silent laugh, it would always seem exaggerated and comical. Wang Po did not like this sort of laugh, because it felt very obscure, as if it concealed many emotions that he could not see through. Many years ago, when he first came to Wenshui and saw the other party in the Tang clan's ancestral hall, he had already disliked him. At the time, the Tang's second master had seen the ragged Wang Po, his eyes turning and his silent smile like he was looking at a stray dog on the street or a poor relative seeking shelter from the rain under a fence. At that time, when Wang Po looked at his face, he felt an extremely strong impulse, or rather, a desire. He wanted to wave the blade in his hand and smash the Tang's second master's face and smile into pulp. But out of respect for the Tang old master, out of respect for his job as an accountant, he did not act. Thus, this desire had always remained in the depths of his heart. Even after so many years, it had not weakened in the slightest. Until today, when he saw the Tang's second master push open the door of a tea-house on the side of the street, that handsome face revealing a shameless and silent smile, Wang Po could no longer suppress his impulse. Kindness truly was as weighty as a mountain, but his blade had truly been thirsty for far too long. Thus, he swung his blade. In Wenshui, when they were still young, he had not been able to shatter the Tang's second master's mocking smile because he did not want to fight, so he had been enduring. Now that he did not want to endure, he wanted to fight, so he could naturally strike. The Tang clan's secret movement technique, myriad golden leaves, truly was difficult to trace and extremely profound, but in Wang Po's eyes it was nothing. In the second month in Wenshui, the Tang old master had gone to the accountant's room and personally taught him this movement technique. He did not need to use his blade. With the blade still sheathed, he could beat the Tang's second master until he could not speak. The Tang's second master sat in the snow, his face covered in blood, his eyes brimming with an indescribable hatred. "My Tang clan wants to protect your life. Since you don't care and want to die, then go die." Wang Po stood up, gripped his blade once more and had even struck him. This naturally meant that he had refused the Wenshui Tang clan's request. He wanted to kill Zhou Tong together with Chen Chongqing, so he had to directly battle Tai Shu. "It hasn't even started. How can you say that you're courting death?" Wang Po looked at the Tang's second master and said, "This is where you are inferior to me, Sun Mei and Xiao Zhang." The beginning of this age of wildflowers bore some remarkable names. Wang Po, Sun Mei, Xiao Zhang, Liang Wangsun, Xiao. Very few people remembered that at the very beginning, there was a name with the surname Tang on the list. They are the same as you. Whether it is talent or opportunity, they are inferior to me. They have never been able to catch up to me, but they have never given up. They have always been chasing after me. Wang Po's gaze fell on the end of the snowy street. He knew that Xiaoda was there, and that Xiao Zhang might also appear. Liang Wangsun had taken refuge in Xuanyang City, and Sun Mei would no longer appear. Cultivation and battle are the same thing. Victory and defeat cannot be determined until the very last moment. In the end, Sun Mei caught up to me in the mausoleum of books, and Xiao Zhang still had a chance. Wang Po drew back his gaze and turned to the Tang's second master. And when you fought with me in Wenshui, you felt that you would never be my match, so you turned to guessing at the human heart and learning strategies. That was admitting defeat. From that moment you became a piece of trash, no longer able to defeat me, no longer inferior to me for the rest of your life. The Tang's second master froze, his expression somewhat perplexed. Wang Po's voice was very calm, devoid of any deliberate mockery. He was only making a cool-headed and objective judgment. But everyone could hear a kind of feeling from these words, a feeling of superiority. Because his words were brimming with the word invincible. This was an expert. Wang Po might have a higher level of cultivation than those equally famous opponents of the world, but he would never be able to crush them, like Xiao Zhang and Liang Wangsun. But in a true battle, he had never been defeated, and he would often crush his opponents and obtain victory. It was because in terms of vigor, willpower, mentality, and understanding of the world and his own heart, he was far superior. As he gazed at Wang Po, Tai Shu revealed an expression of admiration and sorrow. Each generation had its own geniuses, each dominating the world for several decades, but who could possess such a great advantage over experts of the same generation, such boldness? And this wasn't even mentioning the fact that these several decades had been the age of blooming wildflowers. Countless cultivators brimming with geniuses had sprung up like bamboo after the rain. Yet Wang Po had relied on his blade to suppress the experts and geniuses of this generation to the point that they found it difficult to breathe and difficult to stand out. Other than Zhou Dufu, no one else had ever done something like this. Admiration and sorrow ultimately caused the entire world to become wary and uneasy. Zhu Luo did not hesitate to die to have Wang Po die. This was the principle. Since Wang Po was not prepared to listen to the Wenshui Tang's suggestion, he would naturally kill Wang Po. He was even somewhat anxious to kill Wang Po, just like that day in Tanja Temple. Because right now, he, Bianghong, or Wuqiongbai still had the ability to kill Wang Po. If they did not hurry, if another few days passed, if another 2 snowfalls occurred, what would they do? In another few days, if another 2 snowfalls occurred, perhaps they would not be able to kill Wang Po. This sort of understanding was very unsettling. Even the starry sky that enveloped the mortal world would tremble in unease. At that time, would a second Zhou Dufu really appear in the mortal world? No, even if it was just a thought, this was not something that could be permitted. Tai Shu looked at Wang Po and said, "My apologies." Whether it was the oath to the starry sky, the strong bullying the weak, the old bullying the young, or saying that a future titan of the human race would fall, they all deserved his apology. Wang Po did not respond to his apology because in his view, he was not certain that he would lose today's battle. Yes, the entire continent did not believe that he could win, not even if he was Wang Po. But he himself did not think this way. Because the night rain in Xuanyang City was very fast, the fallen leaves in Tanja Temple were very beautiful, and the layers of willows by the Luo River were like mist, but they could no longer obscure his eyes. Wang Po raised his blade and pointed it at Tai Shu, his movements steady and simple. But the blade began to tremble. It was not fear, but a desire to fight, a courage to challenge. From Tanja Temple to the snowy street, it had been many days since he had last used his blade. Everyone knew that the next blade would assuredly be the strongest blade he would use in his entire life. There was only a table between him and Tai Shu. Logically speaking, if he raised his blade, it should have touched Tai Shu's clothes. but when he raised his blade, it was like a great river separated them, so far away that the blade simply could not touch Tai Shu's clothes. Was this vast distance the distance between the divine domain and the mortal world? Could his blade ignore this distance and fall into the starry sky? No one knew. When Wangpa did not use his blade, there were limitless possibilities. When he used his blade, the limitless possibilities would collapse into a single truth. The entire world was waiting to see that single truth. No one knew who would be unable to endure this truth in the next moment. At this moment, Tai Shu made a choice. This choice was very simple, but it represented several centuries of experience. He chose to strike. He would not let Wangpa use his blade. He decided not to give Wangpa the chance to use his blade. No matter what the truth of this blade was, he did not want to see it again. Because he had always wanted to kill Wangpa, not receive Wangpa's blade. When he decided to strike first, no one could be faster than him. Unless his opponent was also an expert of the divine domain, or a divine sanctified Su Yorong or Nank. Wangpa was not. Thus, Tai Shu's hand first fell on Wangpa's blade. At this time, Wangpa's blade still had not been unsheathed. The snow drifting down from the sky suddenly froze. A peal of thunder resounded through the long street. The buildings on both sides of the street were completely pulverized. The countless snowflakes that had been frozen in the air were also pulverized. The smoke vanished. There was not a single person on the street. Wangpa and Tai Shu had vanished. But the peal of thunder had not disappeared. It continued to rise and fall in spirals. Finally, it fell on the Luo River. Chapter 708. This year's winter in the capital was much colder than in previous years. It was still early winter, but the Luo River was already frozen, especially on the surface of the river outside the canal gate. The ice was thick enough for a person to stand on. At this moment, Wangpa and Tai Shu were standing on the icy surface of the Luo River. Between the two of them, there was a breach that was more than 100 feet wide. The river water was rippling inside, and it was incomparably dark, like an abyss. The thunder that resounded through Jingdo rose from the snowy street and ultimately landed there. With his hands behind his back, Tai Shu expressionlessly looked at his opponent, as if he had never made a move before. Wangpa's blade was held horizontally in front of him. His clothes had been torn in many places, especially his sleeves, collar, and sleeves. It was as if they had been blown by a fierce gale for decades. Blood could be faintly seen in those lacerations. It was obvious that he had been injured in a single exchange, and his injuries did not look light at all. However, Tai Shu's eyes did not relax, nor was there any contempt or disdain. On the contrary, they became even more serious, and even somewhat vigilant. Wangpa still had not unsheathed his blade. Several clear finger marks could be seen on the sheath, and it was even clearly bent. He still did not draw his saber. An expert of the divine domain had taken the initiative to attack, but he still had not unsheathed his blade. This was a very puzzling and shocking matter. What was even more shocking was that he was still alive even though his injuries were not light. Back when he was fighting Zhu Luo on the rainy street of Xuanyang City, Wangpa had unhesitatingly used his strongest blade technique, cleaving out countless cracks in space. Only then could he barely keep Zhu Luo's moonlight at the other end of the street. Today, when facing Tai Shu on the snowy streets of the capital, he had not even unsheathed his blade, yet he was able to receive one of Tai Shu's blows. Tai Shu and Zhu Luo were both storms of the 8 directions, and in terms of combat prowess, he was even slightly above Zhu Luo. This could only mean that in these 2 short years, Wangpa's blade had become much stronger than it had been in Xuanyang City. Tai Shu's face was expressionless, but his mood was somewhat complicated. Even without using his saber, Xiao Chen was able to receive his powerful attack head-on and was still standing. He was indeed worthy of being the strongest among the younger generation. He did not know how much progress Wangpa had made in these past 2 years, only that he was more powerful than the rumors said, much more powerful than he had been in Tanja Temple. This rate of improvement was simply unimaginable. He could no longer judge how far Wang Po was from that threshold. It was still the same sentence. Wang Po still did not draw his blade. "What saber is this?" Tai Shu suddenly asked. Since Wang Po had not unsheathed his blade, what was he asking? If there were spectators on the two shores of the Luo River, they would certainly not understand these words. Wang Po understood. Saber was just one word, but it could have many meanings. The blade itself, the moves of the saber, the trajectory of the knife, the path of the blade. He did not draw his blade, but he had already made his move. This move was the horizontal blade. Wang Po's saber Dao and the mysteries of this move were all contained in this horizontal slash. As such, he was able to receive Tai Shu's attack without using his saber. Tai Shu had never seen such a marvelous saber technique. What he wanted to know was the name and origin of this move. "I don't know," Wang Po said. "He didn't tell me." There was still some distance between the Wei estate and the alley of the Northern Military Department, and they would have to cross the Luo River. On their way here, Wang Po and Chen Chongqing had stopped by the banks of the Luo River to chat. The banks of the Luo River had cold willows, embankments, ice on the surface of the river, and stories. When they had first met in Xuanyang City, they had not spoken much. Now that they had reunited in the capital, they knew that they would soon separate again, perhaps even for eternity, so they had chatted a great deal. They had chatted about Wang Jitsa's past, about the Bridge of Helplessness, and about each other's past. Seeing the metal blade at his waist, Chen Chongqing recalled the mausoleum in the Garden of Zhou, as well as the master of the mausoleum, and the blade style drawn on the black coffin. He had an idea. That blade style could not be passed down verbally, so he could only tell Wang Po what he had comprehended from it. Wang Po did not express his thanks, nor did he refuse, but it was clear that he was not very interested. Even though he clearly knew that it was the strongest blade style in all of history. Because he had his own path of the blade, and his path of the blade was the exact opposite of Zhou Dufu's severing blade. Chen Chongqing continued. In the wilderness, he had learned the sword from Su Li. Many cultivators of the world were very interested in this matter, or perhaps very jealous. Wang Po was not jealous because he did not like Su Li. But it was still Su Li's sword, so he was rather interested. Especially when Chen Chongqing mentioned that the third sword that he had learned from Su Li was, in reality, also not something that Su Li had learned. He said to Chen Chongqing that he wanted to learn this sword. Chen Chongqing said yes. They stood under the cold willows by the Luo River and spoke a few words. And then Wang Po learned that sword. He was the third person in the world to learn this sword. And he had only used a few words to learn it. Once Su Li learned of this, he wondered what sort of mood he would have. That sword was called the stupid sword. To learn this sword, one needed to temper it 1,000 times, needed to endlessly repeat it monotonously and impatiently. What this sword required was not talent, but a persistence that bordered on stupidity. So Su Li could not learn this sword, because he was too smart. Logically speaking, no matter how astonishing Wang Po's talent was, he should not have been able to learn this sword in such a short amount of time. Interestingly, Wang Po's method of practicing the blade was very similar to Chen Chongqing's method of practicing the sword. In the past few decades, he had brandished the metal blade far too many times. Now, he only needed to use the sword as a blade to display this sword, or perhaps this blade. Thus, Tai Shu's terrifying hands were not able to break through his sheath. "You lost because you were wrong." Wang Po looked at Tai Shu and said, "You should not have stopped me from unsheathing my blade." Tai Shu was quiet for a few moments, then asked, "What do you mean?" Wang Po replied, "Only when the blade is hidden in its sheath can it have all sorts of transformations and limitless possibilities. Although it is not the strongest, it is the hardest to break." Tai Shu asked, "Do I really have to foolishly wait for you to unsheath your blade?" Wang Po replied, If you do not dare to see the truth of this blade, then the truth will often not be as you wish it to be. Tai Shu's expression was indifferent. His hands clenched behind his back, countless rays of cold light and sharpness seeping out from his fingers, noiselessly slicing apart the wind and snow. This scene was a sign of his current mood, because Wang Pe had guessed his thoughts, so could he have predicted the correct conclusion? His gaze fell on Wang Pe's blade and he taunted, "Then you can show me the truth, if you can still do it." Wang Pe's blade was the truth. From the moment he had left Scolatry Manor, the entire world had been waiting with bated breath. But the blade was already bent beyond repair, so how could he pull it out of its sheath? As he spoke, Tai Shu arrived in front of Wang Pe, his two hands flying through the air. A fierce gale blew over the Luo River, obscuring one's eyes with snowflakes. One could faintly make out the silhouettes of 10 fingers, shaking the snow as they pierced through the air, like a massive tree extending its branches, like a massive flower blooming. Countless unyielding qi suffused with a metallic aura descended upon Wang Pe as those branches extended and petals unfurled. The iron tree bloomed. This was a Taoist technique of the divine domain, a power above the starry sky. No matter how well this blade could defend, it could not conceal the entire starry sky. If Wang Pe did not unsheathe his blade, he would assuredly die. So Wang Pe finally unsheathed his blade. The blade was still in its sheath, but its intent had already risen. An extremely swift and fierce blade Tao that seemed especially simple and sincere soared into the sky. The wind and snow suddenly sped up, countless cracks appearing on the frozen surface of the Luo River. As he sensed this blade intent, Tai Shu's expression instantly chilled, his eyes bursting with killing intent. Only he could see that Wang Pe was using this blade to break through. Chapter 709. From Tianliang to Wenshui, from the south to the land of demons, from Xuanyang City to the capital, from Tanja Temple to the snowy street, Wang Pe had been preparing his blade this entire time. He had been accumulating this blade for many years precisely so that he could cleave open a path between the starry sky and the earth, sever that threshold. Tai Shu could clearly sense that after Wang Pe's blade intent reached its peak, it did not stop there. Rather, it continued to rise, and it was faintly undergoing some inexplicable transformation. Wang Pe had long ago reached the peak of star condensation. If he continued to rise, what else could it be but breaking through? A harsh howl resounded over the two shores of the Luo River. Tai Shu's figure vanished from Wang Pe's eyes, not truly vanished. Between the snowy clouds and the icy surface, his figure could be seen everywhere. The qi of the world and the laws and principles concealed within were affected by his figure. That invisible flower with a metallic luster descended from the heavens and enveloped Wang Pe's blade. He used the world to bind Wang Pe's blade intent. The flower that bloomed between the heavens and the earth was his figure that had appeared out of rage, as well as those two hands suffused with a cold light. When the iron tree bloomed, it bloomed into 10,000 flowers. Each petal represented the laws and principles of the world and was abnormally powerful. If Wang Pe wanted to survive, he had to either see through these laws and principles or break through them head-on. He had only cultivated for a few decades, so how could he see through the methods that Tai Shu had cultivated over the endless years? No matter how much his blade intent increased, it was impossible for him to cleave through Tai Shu's attack that contained the laws and principles of the world. So what should he do? Wang Pe's blade intent rose sharply and burst out of his body. With a light sound, his left arm was severed and sent flying into the sky. A stream of blood appeared in this monotonous world that had no other color besides snowy white. At this moment, the clouds and dancing snow in the sky were painted with a gorgeous color. The sky was covered in blood, a ghastly sight. It was like flowing lava, like rotten plum blossoms, burning everything clean, polluting everything. In this blood, there was an qi that inspired extreme fear and reverence. From some place in the sky came a furious roar of disbelief. It was Tai Shu's voice. From the moment Wang Pa severed his arm was his blade, his blood his Tao, so what sort of blade intent did he use? Why was this saber intent so powerful and terrifying that it could easily break through the laws and principles of heaven and earth? If the Pope or Shang Xingzhou were here, they might have been able to understand. This blade intent was called burning the world, and it was Zhou Dufu's having blade technique. At the end of cultivation, different paths often led to the same destination. However, the saber intent of the having saber that Wang Pa used now had nothing to do with this saying. Previously, by the banks of the Luo River, Chen Chongqing had explained his understanding of the having blade to him, but he had only casually listened and did not care. However, could he really not care? Of course not. Zhou Dufu was publicly recognized as the strongest under the starry sky, and he used a blade. After Zhou Dufu, Wang Po was recognized by the world as the strongest expert in the path of the saber. He also used the saber. Whether he admitted it or not, whether he resisted it or not, Zhou Dufu's path of the blade had always affected his cultivation. As long as this name existed, as long as the having blade existed, this influence would always exist. He knew very well that if he were to use the having blade's blade intent today, even if he could temporarily break through Tai Shu's attack of the laws and logos of heaven and earth, it would certainly greatly affect his cultivation of the path of the blade in the future. However, he still chopped down with his blade. If it was only inheritance, this blade would still not have been enough to chop through Tai Shu's flower. However, he first chopped down on himself. This blade of his came from Zhou Dufu, but what he chopped down was the influence that Zhou Dufu had on him and all those who studied the blade in the future. This was not inheritance, nor was it inheritance. It was acceptance and then abandonment. There was no one in the world who could do this. Even if he was Wang Po, he would still need to sever his own arm. However, as his arm flew into the sky, all the fog in his heart was driven away. The shadows vanished, and his eyes became clear and bright. Then, his blade chopped down at the flower that Tai Shu had bloomed. As a result, the sky was filled with lava and the flower fell like mud. Wang Po's Tao heart was unprecedentedly calm. The blood that sprayed in all directions was blazing hot, melting the snow in the air and the ice on the river. His blade, carrying his blood, broke through the flower petals that represented the laws of the world, and arrived in front of Tai Shu. The blade was still not unsheathed, but its intent had already pierced through the world. That terrifying aura of destruction and destruction, that resolute and cold chi, had already vanished without a trace. Only he remained. Like a snowy mountain, like a green pine, unshakable. If his blade had already been unsheathed, perhaps he really might have been able to defeat Tai Shu. Fortunately, his blade was still not unsheathed. Tai Shu knew that this was a chance he had to grasp. In today's battle on the Luo River, the talent and daring Wang Pa had displayed had truly surpassed his imagination and left him abnormally shocked. But even though Wang Pa had disbelievingly broken through that threshold, Tai Shu still firmly believed that he would easily obtain victory in the end. Because he had long since seen through Wang Po's problem. Wang Pa had hidden his blade for too long. There was enough time and enough momentum. However, it would often bring about new problems that you didn't even think about. For example, his blade was still in its sheath, and the sheath was already bent. If he wanted to unsheath his blade, it would be somewhat more troublesome and slower than before. Even if it was just a flash of lightning, it would be enough to change the outcome of this battle. With a cold howl, Tai Shu's figure appeared above the Luo River. Amidst the myriad flowers, he slapped his palm at Wang Po's head. It was just like it had been at the very beginning. Wang Po seemed not to know that his blade was still in its sheath. He continued to swing his blade, his expression calm, even somewhat wooden. Suddenly, an extremely soft sound resounded through the world. It was a light clap. It also sounded like the yellow leaves of Tanja Temple being blown by the wind, or like the snow on a long street being stepped on by someone. No, it seemed like something had broken. It was the ice that had been melted and thinned by the heat, the willows by the embankment severed by the shock waves. It was the breaking of a silver vase, the arrival of a magnificent army. It was the breaking of the ice, the feeling of spring filling the mountains. It was the breaking of a realm. It was the breaking of Wangpa. Wangpa had broken through. The blade broke through its sheath and slashed at Tai Shu. This was naturally the most powerful blade Wangpa had ever used in his life. The world had to respond to this to express its respect. The snow falling from the clouds suddenly stopped. Countless cracks appeared on the ice on the surface of the Luo River, transforming into several thousand thick ice floes. These ice floes constantly rose up and then fell back down, as if some violent beast was concealed beneath them. In truth, the waters of the river had been disturbed by the qi of the world and were incessantly surging. After some time, everything fell silent once more. Wangpa gripped his blade and gazed tensely into the distance. His severed arm was nowhere to be seen. His body was covered in blood and his face was pale, but his eyes were extremely serene. Tensely away, Tai Shu stood on the ice. He seemed to want to say something, but in the end, he only shook his head. He fell backwards into the river filled with chunks of ice and withered willows, and died. Chapter 7:10. Chunks of ice floated in the river. Tai Shu floated among them, his eyes open, already dead. His eyes reflected the gloomy sky, just like the chunks of ice around him, and the surface of the water. There was a wound on his abdomen, extremely straight and deep. It had directly severed his ethereal palace and all his acupoints, severing his life. From this wound, one could see the blade Wangpa had just struck. His blade was still the same as before, but it had faintly undergone many transformations, the meaning of his cultivation even more profound. In the moment the metal blade left its sheath, he had successfully broken through. The prerequisite for this was that he had removed the shadow that Zhou Dufu had cast on his heart. When faced with the mountain in front of them, some people would choose to take a detour, some would choose to retreat, and some would choose to climb. Wangpa had always been advancing towards that mountain. The peak had always been right before his eyes, but he had never been able to approach it. Only in that moment just now did he destroy his inner demons and establish his own path of the blade. It was not unjust that Tai Shu had died in his battle to establish his Tao. But he had just broken through and his reserves were not sufficient. To slay an expert of the divine domain, he had to pay an enormous price. He had lost an arm, and an injury that was even more terrifying than losing an arm was constantly invading his meridians and mind in his body. The cold winter wind blew through the willows on the two shores of the Luo River, gently blowing away the chunks of ice on the water and everything within them. Although the wind was cold, it was not actually very strong. However, Tai Shu's corpse within the chunks of ice was carried away by the wind into a puff of smoke and vanished. Soon after, the wind ruffled Wangpa's clothes, widening those tears. Blood instantly gushed out like a waterfall. Countless faintly discernible strands of qi followed the blood and left his body. Wangpa's face was bloodless, even whiter than the snow on the river embankment. His body had become incomparably heavy, devoid of strength. He walked towards the shore. The river water mixed with the chunks of ice seemed to have become much more viscous, making it very difficult to walk through. A straight line of blood appeared in the river and then spread to the two sides. The edges were frozen, transforming into something like blood coral. He didn't know where he should go, but seeing that the eastern shore of the Luo River was right in front of him, he walked towards it. He was used to walking forward, but this time he seemed to have made the wrong choice. The heavy willows were blown by the wind and many figures appeared. The first to reach the Luo River was the Tang's second master. Behind him were several hundred cavalry of the Imperial Guard and 2 divine generals of the Great Zhou. His face was full of tiny wounds, and he looked very miserable. This was the injury that Wang Pu and Tai Shu had suffered when they first exchanged blows on the snowy street. As he gazed at Wang Pu in the Luo River, the shock and anger in his eyes gradually disappeared, replaced by indifference. Then, he silently laughed. His smile contained indescribable mockery, contempt, and pity. Yes, you have successfully broken through and become an expert of the divine domain revered by the world. However, in the next moment you will die. What a sad fact! What a story to celebrate! The Tang's second master's smile faded as he raised his right hand and expressionlessly waved it. Several hundred arrows, shining with dazzling light, left the shore of the Luo River and landed in the center of the river. The Li Palace was silent, the atmosphere extremely tense. The snow on the eaves silently melted, but before it could fall, it turned into beads of ice in the air. Time slowly passed, but no one appeared. Madame Mu gazed at the snowy clouds in the sky and slightly arched her brows in surprise. Who had left Shang Xingzhou in the imperial palace? And who had made such a ruckus on the streets of the capital? Tai Shu? No, if it were just him, the thunder would not have been so bright. The thunder ultimately landed on the Luo River. The laws of the world above the Luo River began to change. An invisible flower descended from the sky. A blade intent soared into the sky. Madame Mu was finally moved. Wang Pu had broken through. Tai Shu was dead. This shocked her, and then she fell silent, and then she shivered. The words that Zhu Luo had said in the mausoleum of books before his death were not only for Shang Xingzhou to hear, but also for the two of them to hear. If it was any other time, she would have personally killed Wang Pu. But at this moment she needed to be in the Li Palace, herding the snowy clouds in the sky and temporarily resist the will of the orthodoxy, so she could not leave. Fortunately, she could clearly sense that after Wang Pu defeated Tai Shu, he no longer had the strength to fight. In the capital, he could not fight, which meant death. If he died, would Chen Chongqing still be alive? All around him were assassins, killers, and experts of profound cultivation. Xiao De stood before him. Chen Chongqing was not surprised by the current situation. He knew that his master wanted to kill him, had always known. It was related to the position of Pope, but the more important reason was something else. The relationship between him and his senior brother was too close. He had never mentioned this to anyone, but that did not mean that he was unaware. He had always believed that his master would choose the day his martial uncle, the Pope, returned to the Sea of Stars. So before that day came, he had to finish what he had to do. Under the yellow leaves, he had gone to New North Bridge, and exhausted all his efforts to make arrangements for the little black dragon's escape in 2 years. Under the blizzard, he had come to the alley of the Northern Military Department to kill Zhou Tong. He had not expected that his master would so eagerly want him to die. Perhaps it would be today. Yes, no sound could be heard from the long street. Then it would be today. There was still one last leaf left in the bare branches of the crabapple tree. As the assassin crashed into the wall, the leaf also fell, noiselessly landing on the snow in front of that pair of leather boots. Chen Chongqing's gaze moved up, resting on Xiao De's face. This unparalleled expert of the younger generation of demi-humans had naturally appeared in the alley of the Northern Military Department on the orders of White Emperor City. At the very least, he had obtained the tacit approval of that saint couple. In these past 2 years, many gifts, greetings, and honors had come from White Emperor City to the Orthodox Academy. Now that he thought about it, none of it had any meaning. He did not ask for reasons or reasons, because in the matters of the world, all reasons and reasons, when investigated, would often end with the word benefit. The White Emperor couple had to consider the benefit of the demi-human race. Even if they had once had a good impression of Chen Chongqing, it would not affect their cold judgment. Xiao De had to consider his own benefit, and he had no good impression of Chen Chongqing. For the sake of the 800 li of the Red River and Luoluo, he was very willing to let Chen Chongqing die. "I must ask you to die." Xiao De earnestly said to him, and then he punched. This fist seemed simple, but it was actually incomparably terrifying. The vigorous true essence of the demi-humans carried the chi of the world as it arrived in front of him. At the same time, tensome star condensation assassins thrust their swords out of the snowstorm, sealing off all his paths of retreat. If Chen Chongqing forcefully retreated, he would have to simultaneously confront these tensome terrifying swords, and he would also have to confront the even more terrifying Xiao De's fist. If he chose to advance, he would assuredly be stopped by Xiao De's fist, and those tensome swords would explode with their most terrifying might. It seemed like no matter what he chose, he would die. Perhaps it was for this reason that he chose to advance. Both forward and backward meant death, so why not advance? Of course he had to advance. He broke through the snowstorm and thrust his sword forward. His movements were even faster than Xiao De's fist. His sword intent was like a mountain fire. No, it should be the heavenly fire. The fire descending from the heavens was lightning. His sword was like a bolt of lightning, stabbing into Xiao De's body. At the same time, Xiao De's fist also reached his body. I went to the hospital at noon and returned home at 9 in the evening. I was so tired that I didn't want to write anymore, but as I wrote, I gained more strength. I wrote this chapter, forward. I thought of how Su Lu was constantly moving forward on the flying ship, and then the accompaniment in my head was all a march, especially majestic and powerful. Chapter 7:11. There was only a distance of tensum zhang between the street and the wall. However, it was extremely difficult to walk over. If it was difficult to walk over, then one would burn it. A straight line of fire suddenly appeared. The raging fire melted the wind and snow, turning them into steam and then into smoke. At the very front of this line of fire was Chen Chongqing. To be more precise, this line of fire had originated from the sword in his hand. This was the second sword Su Li had taught him, the blazing sword. Xiao De had an extremely high cultivation level and rich battle experience, but he was still caught somewhat unprepared by Chen Chongqing's sword. This sword was the sword intent of the final move of the Mount Li sword style. It was too decisive, too disregarding his own life. Xiao De had not expected that Chen Chongqing would use this powerful sword that would injure both sides in his first move. And this was something Chen Chongqing had planned out long ago. His true essence was vigorous and his spiritual sense stable, but compared to the true experts at the top of the proclamation of liberation, there was still an insurmountable gap. If he wanted to defeat these experts, he needed to catch them off guard, to use his abilities that no one knew of to the limit. This was because once those abilities and tactics that no one knew of appeared, they would no longer be effective against these experts. This meant that he could only use the same tactic once. In the Orthodox Academy, he had used the Black Stone and the 1,000 Swords to defeat Eunuch Lin, but he could not use the same method to defeat other experts of the same level. He knew that if he wanted to kill Zhou Tong, he would have to face many true experts. Thus, in the last few days, he had made many deductions and designed many contingency plans, simulating battles against Xiao De, Xiao Zhang, Zhou Tong, the Prince of Zhongshan, the Prince of Xiang. He had even considered what he should do in order to find a sliver of an opportunity if he were to fight Wang Pe. A person who liked to read, liked to think, liked to take notes, liked to solve problems would always be more prepared than his opponents, and would often obtain many inconceivable victories. Wang Jitze had only begun to cultivate in his middle age, so why had he so rarely failed from the moment he stepped onto the stage of history? Why was it that when Go Hanshi was still at ethereal opening, everyone felt that he could break into and defeat star condensation? Chen Chongqing was also this sort of person. So he had also succeeded. The success here did not mean that he had defeated Xiao De, but that he had incorporated this battle into his calculations. As the strongest expert of the younger generation of demi-humans, Xiao De had reacted with incredible speed, and his decision had seemed extremely correct. When Chen Chongqing's sword arrived in front of him with determination, his left hand pierced through the snowy sky and directly grabbed towards it. His body was as tough as iron and stone. Ordinary weapons and cultivators below the middle level of star condensation were utterly incapable of harming him. But he did not know that Chen Chongqing's sword was even sharper than described on the tier of legendary weapons. Moreover, Chen Chongqing's Tao of the sword and quantity of true essence far surpassed that of a normal cultivator at the lower level of star condensation. With a soft sound, the dagger cut through his palm like a piece of cardboard cutting through mud cake, and then sank into his body. A furious roar burst out from his lips. Even now, he still believed that his reaction was correct. Although Chen Chongqing's sword pierced through his hand and into his chest, it couldn't leave either, at least it couldn't leave at this moment. If his fist landed, it would definitely smash Chen Chongqing's face into mud. It was truly impossible for Chen Chongqing to dodge, much less leave. Even if he threw away the dagger in his hand, even if he used the Yesher step, because he had moved too quickly, his momentum exhausted. Since he had resolutely advanced, how could he retreat? It seemed like he was delivering himself to Xiaoda's fist. Yet Xiaoda's fist failed to land on his face. A somewhat old-fashioned paper umbrella was opened in his left hand. The umbrella's surface extended out like a real bolt of lightning, covering his body. Xiaoda's fist landed on the umbrella. There was an incomparably heavy thud. The umbrella deeply caved in, but it did not shatter. An unimaginably majestic strength passed from Xiaoda's fist to the yellow paper umbrella, and then to Chen Chongqing's body. There was no trick to this clash of strength. It was completely the manifestation of one's true cultivation. Chen Chongqing could not endure this immense strength and took a step back. With a crack, the ice and snow beneath his feet shattered, and the street below him also shattered. A mouthful of blood surged up his throat, somewhat sweet. So one step was still not enough. He took another step back. Still not enough. The power that came from the yellow paper umbrella was so terrifying, so tyrannical. He continued to retreat, the soles of his boots leaving the ground like a stone, flying through the air. Xiaoda's fist seemed simple, but it contained a lifetime of cultivation and bitter training. Just how terrifying was the all-out attack of an expert of the proclamation of liberation? Chen Chongqing was sent flying, his speed not much slower than when he had used the blazing sword to advance. Fortunately, the speed at which he was sent flying was too fast. Thus, he was able to narrowly avoid the 10 or so swift and fierce sword intents. At the very least, his vitals had been avoided, and only a few tears had been left on his clothes. He landed on the snow, already on the other side of the street. His body swayed as if he would collapse in the next moment. He had resolved to advance. In their first clash, he had used the blazing sword to launch a surprise attack, but he had been unable to obtain victory. He had been forced back 1 step, 2 steps, until he had taken several dozen steps. Anyone could see this as a massive setback. But Chen Chongqing did not think so, nor did Xiaoda. He faintly sensed that Chen Chongqing had done this on purpose. He had been able to avoid the attacks of those tensome sword intents not because of luck, but because he had calculated it beforehand. This sort of feeling made Xiaoda extremely unhappy. When he felt the deep pain in his chest and abdomen, this unpleasant feeling became even stronger. With a furious howl, he lunged down the street, accompanied by the wind and snow. But he lunged at empty air. A blazing light exuded from the stainless sword, and a fierce sword intent pierced through the entire street. Chen Chongqing once more used the blazing sword, and at the same time, he also used the Yesher step. This time, he did not move forward bravely like before. Instead, he pierced through the falling snow and swept diagonally forward. He was like a wisp of smoke, or perhaps a bolt of lightning. There was also a wall there. Behind the wall was not the bare branches of the crabapple tree, not that courtyard. He had no idea where he was. Chen Chongqing smashed through the wall and charged in. Soon after, the sound of walls being smashed could be heard from the buildings on the side of the street. There were many courtyards and residences here, but none of them were where he wanted to go. But the buildings were all separated by walls. As long as he constantly smashed through those walls, he would eventually find his way to the place he wanted to go. That courtyard with the crabapple tree. Moreover, he had always known where that courtyard was. He had never gone in the wrong direction. Sometimes, retreating or taking a detour did not mean giving up, but using another method to advance. This was what Chen Chongqing thought, and this was what he did. The starry sky would always take pity on those young people who were prepared and courageous. He had succeeded once more. The crabapple tree entered his vision, and right after it was the image of a sword. The sleeves of the assassin flickered with stardust. It was actually another star condensation cultivator, presumably also from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secret. In the face of such a sinister and terrifying sword, Chen Chongqing did not pause, nor did he slow down. With a hum, the yellow paper umbrella opened, blocking the falling stardust from the crabapple tree, and also blocking the sword. The sword intent brushed past the edge of the umbrella and tore at the clothes on his shoulder. A sword glow lit up in his hand. Borrowing the cover of the yellow paper umbrella, it cut an extremely deep wound in the assassin's throat. The assassin from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets clutched his throat and collapsed. This assassin had probably killed many famous people. If people knew of his true identity, they would be extremely shocked. Yet Chen Chongqing did not even glance at him. He continued forward. It was not because he was very familiar with the world's most outstanding assassin and the third most outstanding assassin. It was because what he needed the most right now was time. Xiao De would probably catch up very quickly. He did not know when Xiao Zhang would appear. Those experts could surround the courtyard at any moment. Crucially, how long could Wang Pa hold Tai Shu down on the street? He did not know. The crabapple tree swayed, no leaves falling. Only 2 or 3 broken branches fell. In the alley outside the courtyard, Xiao De's furious howl resounded. Several dozen powerful qis were rapidly approaching from all directions. Chen Chongqing had already arrived in front of the stone step. Above him was a palace armchair. A person sat in the chair. This person wore a crimson official's robe. It was like he was in a sea of blood. It was Zhou Tong. Chapter 7:12. The moment Chen Chongqing saw Zhou Tong, a clap of thunder boomed from the street behind him, and then landed in a very distant place. He sensed the battle on the Luo River, sensed the changes in the laws of the world, and also a blade intent that was closely connected to him. That blade intent broke in the next moment, and then a new blade intent appeared. He was first shocked, then excited, and now even more aware of the present situation. Killing Zhou Tong was a matter between him and Wang Pa. Now that Wang Pa had removed the greatest obstacle in this matter, Tai Shu, the rest was up to him. The wind and snow suddenly shattered as a blur appeared in the courtyard. Chen Chongqing borrowed the momentum of the wind and snow to arrive in front of the palace armchair, the dagger in his hand stabbing at Zhou Tong. Along with his sword intent, a wave of dryness and a wave of light also came. This dryness and light came from his fiercely burning true essence. The cold wind ruffled Zhou Tong's official's robe and massive waves rose in the sea of blood. The stainless sword pierced through the waves, plunging straight into the depths of the sea of blood. This was not Chen Chongqing's first time in this courtyard, nor was it his first time attempting to kill Zhou Tong. He had experience, so he was even more cautious. For this moment, he had prepared for a very long time. This attack seemed simple, but it actually concealed countless moves. This attack was the intellectual sword, the vanguard of countless sword technique. The true sword of the orthodoxy, the toppling mountain staff, the gathering evening clouds of the 3 forms of Wenshui, and the cold branch intent of the temple sword were all contained in this attack. After this attack, he had also prepared 3 of his most powerful and unknown moves. No matter how Zhou Tong responded, he would be swallowed up by the countless sword techniques like the raging waves of a river. Or perhaps he would be killed in one blow. Yet the following development somewhat exceeded his expectations. It was not that Zhou Tong had suddenly broken through and become a supreme expert of the divine domain. It was not that his teacher had suddenly appeared on the scene. It was that Zhou Tong's response was somewhat strange. Zhou Tong's response was no response. He did nothing at all. With a squelch, the incomparably sharp dagger easily pierced through the official's robe and stabbed into Zhou Tong's chest like he was stabbing into mud. Perhaps because the official's robe was too red, it was very difficult to see if there was any blood. Zhou Tong's face was somewhat pale, his eyes extremely indifferent. Even when the sharp blade pierced through his body, he did not feel any pain at all. He looked at Chen Chongqing, his eyes full of ridicule, as if he was looking at an extremely stupid dead person. Zhou Tong was a very sinister and powerful minister, an upper-level star condensation expert. The news that Chen Chongqing and Wang Po wanted to kill him had long since spread throughout the entire capital, so it was impossible for him to be unprepared. No matter how well-prepared Chen Chongqing was, it was impossible for him to kill him so easily. The moment the short sword pierced through the crimson official's gown, Chen Chongqing knew there was a problem. Perhaps there was a problem with this entire matter, or perhaps there was a problem with Zhou Tong as a person. In the next moment, Zhou Tong's body vanished before his eyes. The red official robe landed on the armchair. An extremely thick stench of blood flowed along the stone steps like water, then spread and enveloped the entire courtyard. Zhou Tong, who had been sitting in the armchair all this time, was actually not a real existence, but just a piece of clothing. How did he do it? How could he hide it from so many subordinates? Most incomprehensible of all was, how could he hide it from Chen Chongqing's eyes? Chen Chongqing had been born in the sacred light, bathed in dragon blood, had his internal organs washed by the Tianhai Divine Empress. His eyes were incomparably bright. Whether it was an array or a disguise, it was very difficult for him to not see through them. Then there was only one possibility left. What had been deceived was not his eyes, but his mind. Many people knew that Zhou Tong cultivated a secret mental technique to an extremely profound and terrifying level, called the Great Crimson Gown. Perhaps it was because of this? Chen Chongqing naturally knew of the strength of Zhou Tong's secret mental technique. He had once fought with the Great Crimson Gown here, and had even experienced it twice. He truly had not expected Zhou Tong's Great Crimson Gown to be so powerful, far surpassing the last 2 times. He did not know that the last 2 times he could emerge unscathed from Zhou Tong's Great Crimson Gown was because the Tianhai Divine Empress had rubbed a drop of tea between his brows. But now, the person was gone and the tea was cold. Zhou Tong was not here. Chen Chongqing's sword naturally missed. All his preparations, all the countless sword techniques and tricks he had hidden behind him, all of them had come to nothing. Most importantly, his spirit, will, and resolve had all fallen into the air. The cold wind howled, the crabapple tree swayed, and Xiao flew through the air, another fist coming. Chen Chongqing's sword had gone too far, so he naturally could not return too quickly. Under the influence of the wind from the fist, his clothes fluttered in the wind, making his movements seem very slow. However, this sluggishness had a very stable rhythm. He turned his wrist and lightly shook it, placing the yellow paper umbrella in his left hand on his shoulder. This series of actions was very clean and efficient. Xiaoda's fist once more smashed against the yellow paper umbrella, the boundless energy striking solid ground. Chen Chongqing was like a kite whose string had been cut, sent flying into the central room that had only been repaired a few dozen days ago. With a dull thud, his body smashed through several hard stone walls and then heavily crashed to the ground. There was a great cloud of dust as buildings collapsed one by one. He stood up from the gravel on the ground. Xiaoda, covered in blood, had come up behind him like a true monster. The air constantly howled as several dozen experts stood on the walls and trees surrounding the courtyard. Even the weakest of these experts was at the star condensation realm. They came from the various ministries of the imperial court, the military, the pavilion of heavenly secrets, and there were even some that belonged to this place to begin with, assassins of the department for purging officials. Zhou Tong was not here. He had used the secret technique of the Great Crimson Gown to create a great mystery. Today was clearly a trap. Chen Chongqing had stepped into this trap. In the face of this reality, many people would be extremely flustered, their moods somewhat disorderly. Even if they were not flustered and their moods not disorderly, they would always feel a little defeated. Even if their will far surpassed that of mortals, since they had fallen into the opponent's trap, they would always display a little vigilance. Even if their Tao hearts were brightly lit and could completely dispel these negative emotions, they would probably still feel some regret. At the very least, they would want to know, since Zhou Tong was not here, where was he? Chen Chongqing did not. He put away the yellow paper umbrella, put his sword and sheath back together, and then turned to Xiaoda and the surrounding experts. His movements were neither flustered nor disorderly, his expression very calm. There was no sense of defeat on his face, no wariness of some scheme. He had never imagined that the Zhou Tong in the courtyard was fake, which was why he had unleashed such a thunderous strike. Why was he so calm now, as if he had long ago predicted all this? Xiaoda found it impossible to understand his calmness. He grew somewhat wary as he asked, "You guessed it?" Chen Chongqing replied, "I thought about this possibility before, but this place is not easy to enter. If I wanted to kill my way in, I could not think like this, so I did not think like this." These words were rather convoluted, but Xiaoda understood them very clearly. If Chen Chongqing truly believed that Zhou Tong was not here, even if it was just the slightest bit of hope, he would not have been able to press forward with such an indomitable will. And if he could not press forward with such an indomitable will, it would have been utterly impossible for him to reach this courtyard and stab at the Great Crimson Gown on the imperial tutor chair with that sword. Xiaoda asked, "Then why are you so calm?" Chen Chongqing replied, "I've already done my best. With a clear conscience I can naturally be calm." Xiaoda mocked, "It's that vulgar way of speaking again. I'm not talking about my intentions, I'm saying that I've already achieved my goal." After saying this, Chen Chongqing began to cough, seeming to be in some pain. He had received 2 of Xiaoda's punches. Although he had the protection of the yellow paper umbrella, several of his bones had been broken. Not seeing blood was just a habit of his in battle. In reality, the true essence flowing through his meridians was already beginning to slow down. Xiaoda slowly narrowed his eyes. "You don't even know where Zhou Tong is, but you dare say that you've achieved your goal? No one knows where a broken kite will land, but he's not. He's just a dog, and I've scared him so much that he doesn't dare to stay here." Chen Chongqing asked, "How long can a stray dog live?" Chapter 713. Anyone could see that this was sophistry, a forced smile, a forced composure. Xiaoda also believed this, and the derision on his face grew stronger and stronger. Chen Chongqing explained, "If we can kill him, that would naturally be for the best. Even if we can't, driving him out of this place isn't bad either." Xiaoda did not understand his reasoning, and the several dozen experts present did not understand either. Even if it was as Chen Chongqing said, that Zhou Tong had personally laid this trap and turned Zhou Tong into a stray dog, why would a stray dog be so close to death? Whether it was midsummer or winter, stray dogs could be seen everywhere in the capital. Although they lived arduously, they would not die so easily. Moreover, even if Zhou Tong was a dog, he was no ordinary dog. He had the world's sharpest fangs, and they were also coated with the most terrifying poison. But it was precisely because of this that Chen Chongqing felt that Zhou Tong was not far from death. A stray dog would inevitably live in fear, because a rat crossing the street would inevitably be shouted at and beaten by everyone. Xiao De understood and looked at Chen Chongqing as if he were looking at a childish child. Do you really think that someone will help you kill Zhou Tong? In the view of him and many others, Wang Po and Chen Chongqing's insistence on killing Zhou Tong was already the craziest thing in the world. How could there be such a madman in the world? Chen Chongqing very honestly replied, I don't know who will help us kill Zhou Tong. Then he added, but I believe that there will definitely be someone. There were far too many people in the world who wanted Zhou Tong dead. Zhou Tong had left the crabapple tree courtyard, left the alley of the Northern Military Department. No matter how vast the world was, there would still be no place for him to hide. Those people who wanted him dead would assuredly seize this opportunity to deliver the most fatal blow. Because of Shang Xingzhou's existence, the vast majority of those who wanted Zhou Tong dead would probably not move, but there would always be people who would move. And those so-called vast majority would not lend a helping hand to Zhou Tong. They would only coldly watch from the sidelines, watching Zhou Tong die. It was just like what he and Su Li had seen on their journey south from the snowy plains, just like in Xuanyang City. Xiao De did not believe in his judgment. Pitying, he said, when a person is about to die, his heart is also in chaos. What meaning is there in saying such things? Against an expert of the proclamation of liberation like Xiao De and several dozen star condensation experts, no matter how one looked at it, only death awaited Chen Chongqing. Wang Po's current situation was even worse than his. Although he had just broken through, his severed arm was heavily injured and his meridians were severely damaged. Let alone battle, even walking through the icy river was extremely difficult. Moreover, he was currently facing several hundred elite cavalry, 2 divine generals, the Tang's second master, and a torrential rain of arrows that blotted out the sky. The sky was torn into countless pieces by the rain of arrows. Cold winds danced chaotically. Wang Po stood in the river, his expression unchanged. He was still calm, and could even be said to be somewhat wooden. When everyone in the world wanted to kill him, he brought his blade into the capital and battled the divine on the snowy street. With incomparable shock, he severed his arm in the Luo River and broke through, killing a peerless expert like Tai Shu with one blade. No matter how one looked at it, he had reached his limit. His saber Dao had also reached its limit. At this point, he no longer had any regrets, nor could he do any more shocking things. He opened his eyes and calmly gazed at the rain of arrows falling from the sky because there was nothing else he could do. Suddenly, a fierce gale swept through the Luo River, stirring up a storm of snow. This gust of wind was so powerful that the extremely fast arrows were all disrupted and lost all their power. Then, they fell from the sky. Several hundred arrows fell into the cold river, sometimes floating and sometimes sinking. They looked like broken branches, a very dismal sight. The Tang's second master suddenly raised his head to the snowy sky. His expression flickered and a harsh light flashed through his eyes. Wang Po had to die. This was the promise Shang Xingzhou, the White Emperor couple, and the 14 rebellious princes had made to Zhu Luo. It was now very obvious that this was the imperial court's best chance to kill Wang Po, and it was also very likely its last chance. Just as the gale from the snowy sky swept up the rain of arrows, the 2 divine generals made their move. These 2 divine generals were not very highly ranked in the great Zhou army, but their cultivations were extremely profound, far surpassing Shui He's. Many years ago, they had already reached the upper level of star condensation. The tensome willows on the embankment were instantly pulverized, and the 2 dragon-blooded horses whinnied as they were jolted to death. The 2 divine generals soared into the sky, rushing toward the Luo River. 2 spears suffused with cold light stabbed at Wang Po in the Luo River. Whoosh whoosh. An extremely clear sound resounded through the snowy sky. It was like all the ice in the Luo River had instantly melted and then flowed upward, transforming into a waterfall. No, this was the sound of a kite flying high in the sky, blown about by the cold wind. A string was tied to the bottom of the kite, and on the end of the string was a person. That person jumped down from the sky with a swoosh sound. This was the sound of the white paper on his face being blown about by the cold wind. He was like a stone falling into the Luo River, ahead of those two divine generals. Those two powerful spears had arrived. The man raised his weapon, which was also an iron spear. This spear was naturally inferior to the frost god's spear in the imperial palace, inferior to the spear in the hands of divine General Han Qing, and inferior to the spear in Xue Xingchuan's hands. But this spear was also one of the most famous spears in the world. From a certain perspective, it was even more famous than the spears of Han Qing and Xue Xingchuan, because that person was too famous. Now that Han Qing had returned to the land of demons and Xue Xingchuan was buried on the outskirts of the capital, just how many spears in the world could be more tyrannical, more unbridled? The spear exploded forward, blocking the spears of the two divine generals of the Great Zhou. Two extremely muffled collisions resounded over the Luo River, sending waves scattering in all directions. The imperial guards that had already charged into the river were jolted to and fro, the war horses in the willows neighing in pain. The two divine generals were jolted back to the embankment, blood spurting from their mouths. They had actually suffered significant injuries. The person stood in the Luo River, not retreating even half a step. Countless arrows descended from the sky like a torrential rain, like dark clouds, and the Luo River suddenly darkened. The person's spear was held horizontally above the cold water, unshakable like an iron chain. Guided by the energy of the spear, a wall of water more than 100 zhang wide surged up from the Luo River. The arrows shot into the wall of water and were instantly destroyed. Soon after, he drew back his spear and gave it a heavy thump. The end of the spear fell into the water. The water rose up like a waterfall, like a gushing spring, scattering in all directions. Like arrows of water, they shot towards those experts of the army. Groans could be heard all over the Luo River, and blood could be seen all over the surface of the water mixed with ice. In an instant, some experts of the army had been heavily injured and had lost the ability to fight. A moment of silence fell over the world. Whoosh whoosh. The kite flew high in the sky. The wall of water fell into the river. The white paper on the person's face incessantly trembled. With a squelch, a mouthful of blood sprayed from his mouth and struck the white paper, making it look like a bewitching flower. Only at the very end did he decide to act. He was inevitably rather hasty, and his opponent was no ordinary person, but the imperial court. One spear had forced back two divine generals, one spear had blocked the rain of arrows, one spear had heavily injured some experts of the army. Even he would have to pay a heavy price. But he did not care, because at this moment, he was certain that his decision was correct, because he felt very refreshed. A somewhat hoarse voice, brimming with ruthlessness, pierced through the dripping white paper and fell into the ears of the countless people on the two shores of the Luo River. Who else? These words were very arrogant. This person was very arrogant. A fine Xiao Zhang. Chapter 7:14. The river was filled with ice floes and the current was not fast. The bright red blood did not wash away quickly. Fresh blood dripped onto the white paper. Coupled with the few black holes, it looked more terrifying than ever before. Looking at the man standing in the river, the cavalrymen of the Royal Forest Guards felt an unprecedented sense of fear. The two divine generals looked at the clearly bent spears in their hands, and a hint of shock flashed through their eyes. They knew that this person was strong, but they didn't expect him to be this strong. "Are you fucking crazy?" The Tang's second master stood on the embankment, screaming at the man in the river. The expression on his face was abnormally gloomy, and the anger in his eyes was abnormally violent. He was shocked to the extreme, and also angry to the extreme. Wang Pa had severed an arm and broken through, beheading Tai Shu with a single blade. This was a fact that he could not accept. However, seeing Wang Po on the verge of death being saved by this person made it even more difficult for him to accept. No matter how he thought about it, this person had no reason to save Wang Po. Painted armor Xiao Zhang, second on the proclamation of liberation, was only below Wang Po. In the eyes of many, he was the second strongest expert of the middle generation, only below Wang Po. In the past few tens of years, this crazy and violent genius could be said to be invincible in battles against cultivators of the same generation, and it was only when he faced Wang Po that he'd never won. He was naturally the person in the world who wanted to defeat Wang Po the most. Moreover, after the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, everyone knew that he was now standing on the side of the imperial court. He had no reason to not want Wang Po to die, and there was even less of a reason to explain why he had to take such a huge risk to save Wang Po. The cold wind whistled across the river, lifting the white paper on Xiao Zhang's face and brushing off a few lines of blood. In the two black holes on the white paper, she could vaguely see him rolling his eyes. This was naturally directed at the Tang's second master's furious shout. "Are you crazy? I am a madman to begin with. Do you even need to ask?" Of course, everyone knew that the Tang's second master's words were to hear his reason. Xiao Zhang didn't pay him any attention. He was full of disdain. He thought to himself, if you don't even know this, what qualifications do you have to talk to me? If the people present were Sun Mei, Xiao De, or even Liang Wangsun, none of them would ask this question, because they understood. Wang Po also understood, but the Tang's second master did not. Earlier on the snowy street, Wang Po had said that he was far inferior to Xiao Zhang and the others precisely because of this. Even if the Tang's second master's schemes were exceptional and he would one day become a formidable and ruthless character that could influence the entire continent in terms of martial arts, he would never be able to catch up to these people, because he did not understand. Xiao Zhang had never liked Wang Po. Of course, he wanted to defeat Wang Po, and he also wanted Wang Po to die. However, this was built on a premise. He wanted to do it himself. He could not let others do it. Over the past several decades, he had always been inferior to Wang Po. Today, when Wang Po had slain a divine with a single blade in the Luo River, he had been left far behind. It was precisely because of this that he could not let Wang Po die. If that happened, he would never have the chance to defeat Wang Po in this lifetime. Then, even if he entered the divine domain in the future and cultivated to an even higher level, he would still forever be inferior to his opponent. That night, Sun Mei had abandoned his old wish and risked his life to ascend the divine path. Today, Xiao Zhang had gone against his will and risked his life to save Wang Po. "Let's go." Seeing more and more figures on the riverbank, seeing those soldiers once more preparing to draw their bows, Xiao Zhang said these two words. His face was covered in white paper, making it impossible to see his expression, but from the coldness of his voice, he was probably expressionless. Of course, he also did not turn around, even though these two words were clearly meant for Wang Po behind him. Wang Po knew of his personality and did not think it strange. He turned around and began to walk upstream. There was still no sign of the Imperial Guard on that bank. Because his injuries were too severe and he was in the water, his movements were rather slow, but his attitude was very straightforward, without the slightest hesitation. On the contrary, Xiao Zhang's mood became rather strange. He turned around and asked, "You said you wanted me to go, so I naturally went." Wang Po did not turn around. He continued to walk to the bank, saying, "You said you wanted me to go, so I naturally went." Xiao Zhang was somewhat unhappy. He hoarsely yelled, "You're not even going to say thank you?" Wang Po still did not turn around. He only raised his hand and waved it in the air, expressing his meaning. Xiao Zhang was very angry. Just what sort of person is this? He did not know that at this moment, a warm smile had appeared on Wang Po's face. After Sun Mei's death that year, he had never said the words thank you to anyone again. Seeing the activity in the river, the banks began to stir. The Imperial Guard sent out 200-some cavalry and galloped upstream along the official road through the winter willows. It was obvious that these cavalry were preparing to kill Wang Pu. Even if Xiao Zhang could attract the attention of the two divine generals and the Tang's second master, he could not keep everyone where they were. Dust rose from the winter willows and the stamping of hooves could be heard, making the atmosphere particularly tense and dangerous. Crucially, the faint stamping of hooves could also be heard from the other side of the Luo River. The capital was very large and the Luo River was very long, but today, it seemed impossible for Wang Pu to find a place to go ashore. Heavily injured, he could still die at any moment. At this moment, a sword glow suddenly flashed in the winter willow forest on the shore, giving birth to a sword intent. This sword glow was very bright, like a golden crow flying into the sky, about to burn everything. This sword intent was very upright, like a mountain gate. The winter willows suddenly shattered and the war horses heavily crashed to the ground. The sound of a sword cutting through metal and the screams of wounded soldiers rose and fell. As the dust settled, one could see a person holding his sword horizontally on the road and some cavalry lying in pools of blood. It was a young man. To break into star condensation at such an age, even in Wang Pu's generation, was an extremely rare sight. To be able to practice the Mountain Gate sword and the Golden Crow sword into the same sword technique at such an age, even in the Mountly sword sect, his talent in the sword was only below Qiushan Jun's. He was the fourth of the Divine Kingdom's 7 laws, Guan Fei Bai. Soon after, several people madly rushed out of the winter willow forest. Without hesitation, they jumped into the bone-chilling Luo River and swam with all their might towards Wang Pu. They were the teachers and students of Scholartree Manor. With the crunching of wheels on the grey stone, 3 extremely luxurious carriages arrived on the banks of the Luo River. A middle-aged man walked out from the carriage at the very front. It was the head of the Qiushan clan. The 2 carriages remained quiet and no one came out, but anyone could imagine that they were probably the masters of the Tianan clan of similar status to the Qiushan clan head. Guan Fei Bai of Mountly, the teachers and students of Scholartree Manor, and the heads of the Tianan clan had all come to participate in the celebration of the confluence of the North and South. After the celebration concluded, they did not leave for the time being, remaining in the capital. In the past, in this sort of situation, the people of Scholartree Manor would naturally risk their lives to save Wang Pu. Given Guan Fei Bai's personality and the style of the Mountly sword sect, he might also have used his sword. However, the Qiushan clan head and the other 2 clan heads would never appear among the winter willows on the banks of the Luo River. Although Wang Pu was already a cultivating genius renowned throughout the world at that time, it was still not enough for these clans to offend the great Zhou imperial court in the background of the confluence of the North and South. But now was different. Wang Pu had entered the capital to comprehend the blade, broken through to slay the divine, and made a powerful declaration to the entire continent. An expert of the divine domain that had already been proven and a cultivating genius with limitless potential were 2 completely different concepts. After Su Li and the Holy Maiden of the South left, the most vexing, uneasy, and even frightening problem for the Tianan was that they no longer had a supreme expert overseeing them. Now they did. Although Wang Pu was heavily injured and could die at any moment, as long as he could survive, the Tianan would gain another expert of the divine domain. No, the only expert of the divine domain in the Tianan clan. Thus, the Qiushan clan head and all the people of the Tianan clan would not allow Wang Pu to be killed by the imperial court. Absolutely not. Chapter 7:15. Wang Pu was born in Tianliang and was not a southerner, but because of his grudges with the great Zhou imperial court, the people of the south were very willing to accept him. Thus, when he became the master of Scholartree Manor, he was not met with vigilance or hostility. On the contrary, he was welcomed. Compared to Su Li, the Southerners were more fond of his temperament and moral character, more worthy of their trust and reliance. In other words, he was more suited than Su Li to be the banner of the South, but first, he needed to raise this banner. The entire South had been waiting for the day that he would break into the divine, but no one had expected this day to come so early or so suddenly, so no one had been prepared. Today, his metal knife had cleaved through the sky of the capital and raised a flag fluttering in the wind. The South had finally welcomed its own flag. Other than those legendary existences that could no longer be verified, he was the youngest person to enter the divine domain. Perhaps in the future, in the younger generation represented by Qiushan Jun, there would be someone who would surpass him, but no one could be sure. On the embankment of the Luo River, the three carriages slowly retreated. The willow branches gently swayed in the wind, unable to be held back. The Tang's second master's face was very gloomy, but he did nothing. The two divine generals and the several hundred imperial guards also maintained their silence. The three carriages seemed unremarkable, but they represented the attitude of the entire heavenly South, and they clearly expressed their stance. They could do nothing else, or else the imperial court and the Wenshui Tangs would fall out with the entire South. No one could bear this responsibility, not even the powerful personage that the Wenshui Tangs had sent to the capital. In the entire capital, and even the entire continent, there was only one person who could bear this responsibility. Dao Sovereign Shang Xingzhou. The Tang's second master drew back his gaze and looked to a certain place to the north. Of the two things he had to do today, he had already failed one. The remaining thing was more important. The position of Pope represented the resources and strength of the orthodoxy that were as vast as the ocean. Nothing could go wrong. Qin Chongqing must die. The clouds and snow were like a flock of sheep driven by a whip, moving slowly in the gloomy sky. The saints of White Emperor City were temporarily balancing the situation in the Li Palace. The Southerners did not care about Qin Chongqing's life or death or the continuation of the orthodoxy. People like the head of the Qiushan family were even more willing to see Qin Chongqing die. There shouldn't be anyone coming to save Qin Chongqing. In this way, today could be said to be a tie. The three carriages drove out of the capital without any obstruction. The snow-covered 5-mile plain was completely revealed on the other side of the Bai River. After crossing the bridge, one could step onto the official road back to the south. Guan Feibai indicated for the carriage to stop. After saying a few words to the Qiushan clan head, he bowed and prepared to leave. The curtain of the carriage in front was raised, revealing Wang Po's somewhat pale face. "What are you going to do?" Guan Feibai said. "That guy should be in a lot of trouble right now. I'll go see if I can help." When he said this, his tone was very natural, as though it was a matter of course. Thus, even though his voice was very calm, it still gave off a very righteous feeling. Wang Po smiled, thinking, the Mountly Sword sect truly is extraordinary. These young disciples are all much stronger than Senior Su Li. There's no need to go. He continued, that guy has his own plans. There's no need for more help. As they walked from the assistant minister's estate to the northern part of the city, they chatted on the banks of the Luo River. They talked about Wang Jitsa, the Garden of Zhou, the Path of the Blade, and the Sword Soul. Naturally, they also talked about what they were about to do. That guy had asked him to help delay Tai Shu, but he had asked for nothing else. Wang Po had done even more. He had slain Tai Shu, so that guy could naturally finish the rest. Snow fell on the ruins on that guy's shoulder. A sword glow shot out of the snow like a bolt of lightning. At this moment, the sword glow was still 10 some zhang from him, but it would arrive in the next moment. The sword of a star condensation expert could ignore this distance. Qin Chongqing did not look. He continued to stare at Xiaoda, completely disregarding that sword glow. He seemed rather arrogant and conceited. In reality, this was not the case. When the sword glow appeared, he had already attacked. It was just that other than the extremely close Xiaoda, no one else had noticed. The clear cry of a sword resounded through this courtyard deep within the alley of the Northern Military Department. It was the sound of two swords clashing. The snow suddenly dispersed, and an expert of the department for purging officials was forced to reveal himself. With a groan, he retreated. A chip the size of a grain of rice had appeared on the sword in his hand. This was the mountain sword of his sect, something he deeply treasured, but he had no time to grieve over it. His heart was filled with shock. He stared at the snowy sky in front of him, his face pale like he had seen a ghost. In the snowy sky, an ancient sword was floating, emitting a low buzzing sound. What sort of sword was this? It was actually able to injure his sect's mountain sword? More importantly, this sword, just where had it come from? While he was still in a state of extreme shock, another sword glow pierced through the snow and stabbed at Chen Chongsheng. This sword glow was even more sinister. It rose 2 feet from the ground, its angle abnormally crafty. It actually carried a hint of a shaman sword style. Chen Chongsheng saw the sword glow, but he still did not move. The cold wind was suddenly thrown into disorder. An old sword appeared in front of this sword glow as if it had appeared out of thin air. The 2 swords clashed and clattered. With a strange cry, an assassin from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets fell from a tree into a pile of snow. A wound had appeared on his left shoulder, dripping with blood. What's going on here? This assassin from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets activated his movement technique and madly swung his sword, doing his utmost to block the pursuit of that old sword as he shouted in extreme shock. Several thunderous collisions resounded through the snowy sky. Several experts of the Great Zhou army who had been attacking from the front let out muffled grunts as they were jolted back to the bottom of the courtyard wall. Their sword-wielding hands trembled, their expressions grave. Several more swords appeared out of thin air in the snowy sky, but they were different from the swords that had appeared like ghosts. These swords were clearly much thicker and heavier. Even after hundreds of years of tempering, these heavy swords still contained extremely terrifying power. A strange atmosphere enveloped the courtyard. No one else attacked. With a clear hum, the old sword that had pursued the assassin from the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets flew back through the snow and came to a stop in front of Chen Chongsheng. More than 10 swords quietly floated in the air around him, receiving the snowflakes falling from the sky and guarding all directions. These swords were of different shapes and different cheese, but they all had one thing in common: they were all very old. Some of the swords even had traces of rust on them, but this did not diminish their sharpness. Seeing this scene, the experts of the imperial court recalled that rumor. Their expressions turned extremely grave, and they even began to show signs of fear. If that rumor was true, this was probably only the beginning. Sure enough, in the next moment they heard a lot of voices. Clang, clang, clang. It was not the sound of swords rubbing against scabbards, but the sound of swords cutting through the snowy sky. Countless swords flew out of Chen Chongsheng's body. They were like countless fish constantly surging out of a deep pool. Sword intents and sword glows exploded in the courtyard, drowning out the color of the wind and snow. Chapter 7:16. In these 2 years, that rumor had always existed, but no one believed it, so it was gradually forgotten. Because it made no sense. No matter how talented Chen Chongsheng was in the path of the sword, he still had to be reasonable. Today, they finally saw that legendary scene and realized that the rumor was actually true. It truly made no sense. First, one had to have so many swords. Second, one had to have a sufficiently powerful spiritual sense, so powerful that it surpassed imagination, so stable that it was unimaginable. Only then could one control so many swords. Moreover, it could not be simple control. If one could only use one's spiritual sense to control these swords to slash and stab, one would be unable to make more complex transformations or respond in a timely manner. To star condensation experts like them, it was meaningless. They could completely disregard it. Yes, one had to have so many swords, and one's spiritual sense was so powerful that it could be grasped like a hand, but one also had to know so many sword styles. These requirements were too high. Logically speaking, no one under the starry sky could accomplish them. However, these conditions seemed to be tailor-made for Chen Chongqing. He had so many swords, he could control so many swords, or perhaps these swords were willing to listen to his will, and then he knew so many sword styles. Thus, Chen Chongqing could accomplish this seemingly illogical thing. As a result, to the experts of the imperial court, today's battle had become an illogical thing. Chen Chongqing only needed to simultaneously control these swords in the air to attack, and it would be equivalent to several dozen or even several hundred Chen Chongqings attacking. How could they fight this? Snowflakes drifted down from the sky, falling on Chen Chongqing's shoulders and painting him with a thin layer of white. At the same time, these snowflakes also fell on the several hundred swords around him, adding many white lines to the world. He walked forward, and the several hundred swords in the air moved forward with him, noiselessly. This scene was abnormally bizarre, causing one's heart to palpitate with fear. The several hundred swords faintly vibrated in the wind and snow, making no sound. Only when an external force disturbed them would they hum. Several sword glows abruptly illuminated a corner of the wind and snow. The crisp hum of swords and the dull clashing of swords resounded at almost the same time. A stream of blood flew out and fell onto the snowy ground. A broken sword stabbed into the wall at an angle, so deep that its shadow could not be seen. The sword glows suddenly faded, and then everything returned to silence. The two experts of the imperial court who attempted to launch a sneak attack were unable to pass through the sword net formed by the several hundred swords. One was injured while the other retreated. A few traces remained in the wind and snow. One could faintly make out the general appearance of the second move of the true sword of the orthodoxy and the gathering evening clouds of the three forms of Wenshui. Chen Chongqing walked through the dilapidated courtyard, and the hundreds of swords in the air followed him, passing through the walls of the courtyard, like fishes passing through rocks in a stream. There was a large water tank in the courtyard over there. There was a thin layer of ice floating on the surface of the tank. Chen Chongqing glanced in that direction. Hundreds of swords followed his gaze and aimed at the water jar. Crack, crack, crack. Countless cracking sounds rang out at the same time. The thin layer of ice on the surface of the water jar was cut into countless pieces. At the same time, the water jar itself was also cut into countless pieces. Amidst the splashing sounds, water poured out of the vat, stirring up the snow on the ground. At the same time, an assassin covered in blood fell to the ground along with the water. The assassin's body was riddled with sword wounds and was constantly bleeding, but he didn't seem to feel any pain and only looked at Chen Chongqing in shock. "Retreat further!" an official of the Department for Purging officials yelled. They were all star condensation experts with rich combat experience. They quickly reacted. As long as they maintained a sufficient distance, the threat of these swords would be greatly reduced. There were even some people who had calculated a safe distance, which was around 8 zhang. Instantly, there was the sound of rushing wind. Several dozen experts appeared and scattered around the courtyard. They were at least 10 some zhang away from Chen Chongqing, but they did not leave. Seeing this, Chen Chongqing's steps did not pause. He continued forward, quickly returning to the courtyard in the alley of the Northern Military Department. The crabapple tree in the courtyard no longer had a single leaf. Its bare branches stretched out in the snowy sky and did not take up much space. But when the several hundred swords arrived in the courtyard, the space seemed rather cramped. Broken branches were not fallen leaves. When they fell from the sky, they would not rustle. That crabapple tree that had been moved here from the mountains on the outskirts of the capital no more than a few weeks ago had noiselessly disintegrated into countless splinters of wood, becoming a pile on the snowy ground. This scene was still very strange. The courtyard was filled with swords, swift and fierce to the extreme. The world was filled with sword intense, incomparably awe-inspiring. Anyone who wanted to break through these swords and attack Chen Chongqing would have to face the all-out attack of these awe-inspiring sword intents. On the snowy street, Wang Po and he had split up. Wang Pe had gone to fight Tai Shu because he was skilled at defeating the strong from a position of weakness. Reality had proven that he had truly succeeded. Chen Chongqing had come to this courtyard to kill Zhou Tong because he was skilled at fighting one against many. This was the same principle. He's finally using his strongest move? Xiaoda stood at the stone gate of the courtyard and looked at Chen Chongqing. At this moment, Chen Chongqing was standing on the stone steps. The distance between the two was neither too far nor too close, neither too much nor too little, precisely a zhang. This distance explained many things. Firstly, Xiaoda did not have the confidence to simultaneously face the collective attack of several hundred swords. Secondly, he seemed to have a deep understanding of Chen Chongqing's moves. Just like what he said. A few days ago, Eunuch Lin had been heavily injured in the Orthodox Academy, shocking many people who knew the inside story. Chen Chongqing's moves had long ago been no secret to people at Xiaoda's level. Within the same level, you truly can be said to be invincible. Xiaoda continued to speak, somewhat sorrowful. Invincible within the same level sounded very normal, but this was not the case. In the last 1,000 years, no one had been able to do this. Before breaking through, Wang Po's strength had been roughly on par with Shueqingchuan's. When Su Li was at the initial level of star condensation, he had been beaten like a dog by a girl from the snowy plains of the north. Even Zhou Dufu, hailed as the strongest expert under the starry sky, everyone knew that when he was at the upper level of ethereal opening, he was assuredly not a match for the precocious Chen Xuanba, even if Chen Xuanba had also been at the upper level of ethereal opening. The current Chen Chongqing could truly be invincible within the same level. He was at the initial level of star condensation, and there were faint signs of another breakthrough. But let alone the initial level of star condensation, not even the middle level of star condensation could find a single person that could defeat him. Not a single one. It was impossible, because the number of swords he had was the number of him. To fight with him was to fight with countless of him. Who could defeat him? Fortunately, it's only invincible within the same level. Xiaoda sighed. Otherwise, I really would have to turn and leave. Chapter 7:17. Yesterday I wrote the wrong sentence about Su Li. First, I apologize, and then I thank my friend who likes to make trouble with flying saucers for reminding me. Regarding bugs, there will definitely be a lot of articles in the coming days. After Mother fell ill, the entire family spends the vast majority of their time in the hospital. I truly do not have enough time and energy to devote to work, so I will often stop updating and the quality will definitely not be stable. I ask for everyone's understanding and kindly remind me to testify. In the future, I will properly revise. Today, before I went to the hospital, the leader said to give Mother some nuts to eat. I smugly ran over to the tea table and bent down, and then, oh no, the protrusion of my lumbar disc came back. After a year, I thought back to last year's meeting with my book friends in Guangzhou. It felt very familiar. It was still that smell, it was still that inconvenient to move, it was still that pain, the pain of cursing. So, this is useless to me, Xiaoda very seriously said to Chen Chongqing. No matter how much hot water was added to the wooden tub, it was impossible to make the water boil. Even if you piled earth into a mountain taller than the mausoleum of books, it would still be impossible for it to be harder than stone. Even if Chen Chongqing really could turn himself into 10,000, he still could not rely on quantity to break through to a higher level. This principle was not difficult to understand. Cultivating the Tao was the cruelest thing in the world. It was never believed that hard work could make up for one's lack of talent, that quantitative change could never lead to qualitative change. Right now, he could simultaneously face many initial or even middle-level star condensation experts, but it was very difficult to kill them all. More importantly, when he was facing peak star condensation experts like Xiaoda and Xiao Zhang, the gap in cultivation levels between them would rapidly reduce his advantage in numbers. Back in the Garden of Zhou, He had been able to directly confront the golden-winged Great Ping controlled by Nank, not because he was powerful, but because the 10,000 famed swords that had awakened in the sword pool had transformed the yearning they had accumulated over the centuries into battle intent. Only then could he display that world-shaking ultimate strike. Now that the Garden of Zhou was quiet and the famed swords had returned to their respective mountains, the swords that remained by his side, nourished in the vault sheath and gradually becoming new, were no longer capable of condensing that sort of battle intent. In other words, the mystical sight of 10,000 swords forming a dragon could no longer be reproduced in this world. Of course, you're still very frightening. With sorrow for the present and fear for the future, Xiaoda said, if you survive and cultivate to the peak of star condensation, just what sort of situation will you and your swords create? If it really was as Xiaoda said, then the future Chen Chongqing would be able to fight against 10,000 cavalry, able to besiege cities and destroy countries. At that time, people like us will not be able to resist at all in front of you. We will be beaten like dogs by you. Xiaoda paused, then looked at Chen Chongqing and continued, and this is unfair to us. The courtyard was deathly still. The broken crabapple tree had died a long time ago, and even the wind was silent between the floating swords, not daring to move. When the experts of the imperial court heard Xiaoda's words, they fell silent, complex emotions on their faces. Chen Chongqing didn't say anything. His thin lips were slightly pressed together, forming a line. Just like the line formed by the hundreds of swords in the snowy sky. No martial cultivator was willing to see such a future. They were willing to become a dog under the sword of a peerless genius. Moreover, they were enemies to begin with. In order to prevent such a terrifying future from appearing, the only thing they could do, the only thing they had to do, was kill the current Chen Chongqing. Xiaoda continued to calmly stare at Chen Chongqing. Suddenly, a tawny light surged out of his eyes and a terrifying qi emerged. This qi was brimming with a primitive and barbaric aura. Even the tiniest fragment seemed to be dripping with the freshest beast blood. His clothes were stretched taut, revealing his inner body that was as sturdy as a mountain, and then they were pierced through by countless beast hairs that were as hard as steel needles. His chest originally had an extremely deep wound. It was caused by Chen Chongqing's blazing sword when they first fought. It had been slowly bleeding, but at this moment the bleeding suddenly stopped. The wound healed at a speed visible to the naked eye, and then it could no longer be seen. Chen Chongqing tightened his grip on his sword. He knew that his opponent was about to use his strongest move. The demi-human race possessed many advantages that humans found difficult to compare to, such as speed, strength, and the natural toughness of their bodies. But their greatest advantage was that demi-human experts could temporarily reveal their true bodies, borrowing from the ancestral bloodline hidden in their fate wheels to increase their speed and strength, allowing their bodies to become even more resilient. This was the berserk transformation. There was a hum in the courtyard. The crabapple branches scattered on the ground were blown up by the wind and smashed against the wall, where they became even finer. Xiaoda disappeared from the stone gate and appeared in front of Chen Chongqing. The several hundred swords in the snowy sky trembled, then suddenly fell silent. In a flash, Xiaoda had crossed the distance of 8 zhang and been struck by the 6 swords. But these 6 swords that had successively displayed exquisite sword techniques could not slow his steps in the slightest. 6 sword slashes appeared on his body, blood seeping out of them. As the supreme expert of the senior generation of the demi-human race, his body was terrifyingly tough, and after the berserk transformation, it had reached an inconceivable level. If not for the fact that Chen Chongqing's swords had all come from the sword pool, famed swords from several hundred years ago, he might not even have been able to leave a few sword slashes on Xiaoda's body. In the wind and snow, Xiaoda's fist smashed down at Chen Chongqing. Just like at the very beginning, when they had first met outside the wall, he still did not use a weapon. After returning from Mount Han, Xiaoda's temperament had become much steadier, and his cultivation had also improved. The greatest change was that he had become even more confident in his fist. He had a weapon, but on the mountain path of Mount Han, before he had time to pull it out, Lu Qing had stabbed him with the sword. And then, in the persimmon forest by the stream, he had encountered the demon lord. Whether he took out his weapon or not, it was still a joke. From that point on, Xiaoda abandoned his weapon and only used his hand. Compared to swords, sabers, spears, and magical artifacts, only the hands were the true weapons of cultivators. Attacking was faster than drawing the sword. It was also faster than Chen Chongqing's sword. Before Chen Chongqing could strike, Xiaoda's fist had arrived. Fortunately, he had been holding the yellow paper umbrella in his left hand. The umbrella borrowed the wind to rise and block Xiaoda's fist. The umbrella's surface caved in, a massive force surging through it. With a boom, Chen Chongqing's left foot, which had been left behind, sank deep into the ground. The hard stone floor was crushed into a spiderweb by his foot, the center sinking deep like a whirlpool. Several cracking sounds came from his body. He didn't know which part of his bones had cracked, or even broken. A sword glow that was so sharp that it seemed rather mournful lit up at the edge of the yellow paper umbrella. Xiaoda bellowed and raised his fist to strike again. For a moment, a fierce gust of wind swept through the courtyard. The crabapple branches in the courtyard all disappeared, countless cracks appeared on the walls, and chunks of lime incessantly peeled off. It seemed like tens of thousands of years had passed in this brief moment. As the fist descended like a mountain, the experts of the imperial court collectively attacked Chen Chongqing. Sword intents crisscrossed the courtyard, countless sword techniques emerging one after another. After an unknown period of time, the place became quiet again. Xiaoda borrowed the force of the recoil to sweep back to the stone gate of the courtyard like a sandstorm, seemingly completely unharmed. Suddenly, a soft scratching sound rang out on his face. With this sound, a sword wound grew to about half an inch across his face. Blood flowed out, so deep that bone could be seen. It was abnormally terrifying. Chen Chongqing stood in front of the stone steps and sheathed his sword. Several hard beast hairs fell from the sky and smashed on the ground like steel needles, emitting a crisp sound. With this sound, Chen Chongqing began to cough, coughing incessantly. His face grew paler and paler, his feet trembling in the rubble and his body tottering. It was obvious that his injuries were even worse than Xiaoda's. Xiaoda's expression was very grave, but it was not because he had been injured by Chen Chongqing again. No matter how tough his body was, it was impossible for him to resist the stainless sword on the tier of legendary weapons. It was because there was not a single sword wound on Chen Chongqing's body. This meant that in the chaotic battle just now, none of the swords of the several dozen experts of the imperial court had been able to get close to him. In the face of his full-strength attack, Chen Chongqing had clearly suffered significant injuries, so how could he still control the several hundred swords in the courtyard? Xiaoda was very confused. It must be known that although the strength of Chen Chongqing's spiritual sense far surpassed that of ordinary cultivators, it was not too exaggerated for an expert like him. Just how had Chen Chongqing done it? Xiaoda silently gazed at the several hundred swords in the snowy sky. He did not understand this matter, but he could at least confirm that for Chen Chongqing to simultaneously control these several hundred swords, it was assuredly consuming his spiritual sense at an extremely rapid rate. If this battle continued, it was highly likely that Chen Chongqing would not fall, but his spiritual sense would already be exhausted. How much longer can you last? Xiaoda drew back his gaze and looked at Chen Chongqing. If you insist on staying here, the final outcome will be to be punched to death by me one punch at a time. Several hundred swords calmly floated in the snowy sky, guarding Chen Chongqing's surroundings. This could be viewed as a defensive sword array, or as an offensive vanguard, but it was also like a prison cell. It was very difficult for others to break into this prison cell, and it was also very difficult for Chen Chongqing to walk out, because he did not dare to open the door. So how much longer could he last? I don't know. Chen Chongqing thought for a while, then said, at least until Zhou Tong dies. Upon hearing this, Xiao De finally understood and was somewhat shocked. In truth, Chen Chongqing had already expressed his stance before, but he and the surrounding experts of the imperial court had not believed him. But now, Xiao De was more and more convinced of his words, because even now, Chen Chongqing still had not left, still standing in front of the stone steps. Chen Chongqing was here, so he and all the experts of the imperial court could only remain here. The Great Zhou Imperial Court's arrangements today had originally been to kill Wang Pu and Chen Chongqing, but after fighting for so long, Xiao De had already given up on this idea. He knew that Chen Chongqing still had tricks up his sleeve. Just these swords floating in the snowy sky were simply not enough to defeat Eunuch Lin in the Orthodox Academy. If Chen Chongqing used those tricks, he could at least break out of the encirclement. Why did he not leave? Could it be that he really was stalling for time, waiting for Zhou Tong to be killed by someone else? Chen Chongqing said nothing more, because he had already given his answer, and twice. At the very beginning of today, it had been him and Wang Pu who wanted to kill Zhou Tong. Later on, the imperial court used this matter to kill him and Wang Pu. The situation was constantly changing, constantly swinging back and forth. That person had still not appeared. He had probably been left behind in the imperial palace by his senior brother. The Li Palace had been quiet this entire time, presumably temporarily suppressed by that saint. But that saint naturally could not do anything else. The most crucial change in the entire situation was that Tai Shu had not been able to kill Wang Pu, but had been killed by Wang Pu. Thus they traced the source. The situation had returned to its original starting point. It was still killing Zhou Tong. So he would hold on here, hold on until Zhou Tong died. He believed that Zhou Tong would assuredly die. No matter who killed him, he would die. Chapter 7:18. For many reasons, Chen Chongqing had to kill Zhou Tong. One of the most important reasons was that the coup of the Mausoleum of Books had begun with his killing of Zhou Tong. When he had walked into this courtyard, it had been the beginning of the change in history, the source of all life and death. Now the Tianhai Divine Empress was dead, many people were dead, and the river of history had taken a great turn. Yet Zhou Tong was still alive and well, perhaps even living better than before. No matter how he thought about it, he felt that he should finish this matter. Even now, he still did not know where Zhou Tong was. At this moment, Xiao De and he simultaneously lowered their heads to look at the snow on the ground of the courtyard. The snow was currently moving extremely faintly, as if an extremely weak tremor was coming from the depths of the earth. Several officials of the Department for Purging officials glanced at each other, their faces filled with shock and doubt. Their eyes quickly became determined as they tightly gripped their swords and looked at Chen Chongqing. Chen Chongqing did not look at them, only stared at the snow on the ground. Suddenly, tensome sword glows illuminated the courtyard and slashed at the ground. The snow madly danced and the sword intents were swift and fierce. The gray stone floor was instantly shattered and black dirt flew into the air. In just a few moments, a hole half a foot deep had been dug into the ground of the courtyard. The officials of the Department for Purging officials bellowed in shock and fury, one after another using their most powerful sword techniques in an attempt to force Chen Chongqing to stop his actions. Xiao De vaguely guessed at something, and a vicious light exploded in his eyes. His two fists were like mountains as they smashed at the several hundred swords in the air. There had once been a crabapple tree in this courtyard, but it had been destroyed by Chen Chongqing. Later on, a new crabapple tree had been moved in, almost exactly the same as the original. Even the cold-blooded and emotionless officials of the Department for Purging officials who had no interest in beautiful things found this rather strange. Of course, this crabapple tree had also been destroyed, similarly by Chen Chongqing. In order to find this exact same crabapple tree, the yamen of the Department for Purging officials had expended a great deal of effort. After waiting for some time, the pit dug in the ground near the courtyard wall had been empty for a very long time. On a certain autumn night, it had even transformed into a small pond. However, before dawn, the water had sunk into the earth and vanished without a trace. The office of the Department for Purging officials was located in the alley of the Northern Military Department, which was also known as Zhou Prison. However, very few people knew that the true Zhou Prison was actually 70 zhang below the tree pit in the gloomy underground. It was formed from 5 prison cells, its walls made of stone surrounded by compacted earth and countless jagged fragments of stone. It was also protected by countless arrays. This place was deep underground, and there were layers upon layers of formations concealing it. It was extremely secretive, and no outsiders had ever entered before. This place was very sturdy. Whether it was Chen Chongqing's first charge into Zhou Prison, the 10,000 swords like a rainbow, the fierce blade intent, or the sword intents crisscrossing the ground, none of them had any effect on this place, not even the slightest ripple. In the deepest prison cell, the dim light was very stable, shining on the small table in the room. On the table were a plate of peanuts, 2 pots of wine, and 2 pairs of chopsticks. The middle-aged man sitting on the east side had a tall and sturdy figure. Although his prison uniform was covered in blackened bloodstains, his hair was disheveled, and he had a missing arm, it was still impossible to conceal his heroic and valiant aura. It was precisely the divine General Shui, he who had been brought back to the capital a few days ago. The middle-aged man sitting across from him was not wearing official robes, but an ordinary cloth gown. His figure was thin, his cheeks sunken, his face pale, and his eyes deep and serene. He looked just like a ghost. Many people had died in Zhou Prison, but it was unknown if there were any ghosts. Even if there really were, they had probably been tortured beyond words by this person and had long since reincarnated. He was the master of Zhou Prison. In this place, even ghosts feared him. That breathtaking sword strike from before had only pierced through his red official's robe. From that moment on, everyone, whether it was Chen Chongqing or anyone else, was guessing where he was hiding. Many people believed that he was hiding in the imperial palace, while others even believed that he had been scared out of his wits and fled the capital. No one expected that he would still remain here, remaining in this courtyard, just that he was deep underground. To put it another way, there had always been a distance of 17 zhang between him and Chen Chongqing. He cared nothing about this, calmly eating peanuts and drinking wine. It seemed like no matter how fierce the rain of swords on the ground was, it had nothing to do with him. "You're afraid," Shui he said as he looked into his eyes. He was a very famous divine general of the Great Zhou because he was Shui Xingchuan's younger brother, but this did not mean that he was incapable. On the battlefield of the north, he had led the soldiers against the wolf cavalry of the demon race in a war that had lasted for decades. He had a very deep understanding of life and death and fear. When people were at their most fearful, they would often insist on staying in the place they were most familiar with, even if this choice was not the wisest. Zhou Tong had not gone to the imperial palace, but had stayed here. Afterwards, some people might sigh in admiration at his composure and intelligence, but in Shui He's view, this could only mean that he was afraid. The Zhou prison deep underground was the place Zhou Tong was most familiar with. In this place he had killed far too many people, demons, tortured far too many people, demons. Zhou Tong did not go to the imperial palace because of the warning in the depths of his heart and his distrust of that saint. However, he would not explain this to Shui he was his prisoner and did not have the right for him to explain. Moreover, he did not want anyone to know that his loyalty to that saint was not as firm as others imagined. The prison cells deep underground were too damp and dark. It was impossible for people to feel comfortable, even for Zhou Tong himself. The cell Shui he was in was relatively the driest one. Only after a very long time would a single drop of water fall from the stone wall above, and it would not land on the table or the bed covered with straw. This was naturally preferential treatment, even though the golden thorns on Shui He's body that were used to restrict his cultivation had been personally pierced by Zhou Tong. "Don't try to anger me," Zhou Tong calmly said. "I won't kill you. After all, he said that we are also brothers." Zhou Tong and Shui Xingchuan were brothers, and Shui Xingchuan and Shui He were also brothers. Only the three brothers and Madame Shui knew of this matter. In the past few years, Shui Xingchuan had always hoped that Shui He and Zhou Tong could also become true brothers. Shui He did not like Zhou Tong, but he had never expressed it. When he learned that his big brother had been personally poisoned to death by Zhou Tong, he was filled with extreme grief and indignation, but he remained calm. This was because he had never treated Zhou Tong as his brother, and he also knew that Zhou Tong was this sort of person. Upon hearing these words, he finally lost control of his emotions and spat out a mouthful of phlegm, tinged with blood. Zhou Tong turned to dodge, but he did not turn back. He maintained this posture, gazing at a stone wall in the southwest corner of the prison cell. He could sense that deep within that stone wall there was a very light but distinct vibration. Someone had touched the array. Chapter 719. Zhou Tong stared at the stone wall, his eyes growing deeper and more sinister, like two balls of will-o'-the-wisps. This weak vibration seemed very ordinary, but to this underground world that was protected and stabilized by layers upon layers of arrays, it signified something very frightening. Someone had touched Zhou Prison's array, and it was not like an insect throwing itself into a spider's web. It was like a zither player stretching out his finger, pulling on a string and lightly plucking it. Zhou Tong stared at the stone wall. He did not notice that a drop of water had fallen from a crack in the ceiling of the prison cell. The underground was very humid. Even with the isolation of the array, the surrounding walls still had many places where water was seeping through. Even in this relatively dry prison cell, this scene did not seem too out of place. The problem was that this drop of water had fallen in a very coincidental position, right on the mouth of the wine pot. The moisture in the earth had been filtered through the layers of rocks and arrays. By the time it seeped out of the stone wall, it was completely devoid of impurities, as clean as a dewdrop. The dewdrop noiselessly slid down the slender porcelain spout and into the wine pot. At this moment, Zhou Tong turned around. "Shui," he said, "Chen Chongqing should have sensed it. He should have guessed that you were here." Zhou Tong knew, so he was in a hurry to leave. He did not know who had touched the array, but he had actually managed to enter Zhou Prison. That person should still be some distance away, but he had still unhesitatingly decided to leave. Just as Shui He had said, that person had very likely used this method to inform the people above of his specific location. He calmly said, "There have always been many people who wanted me dead. I'm the same." Shui He raised the wine pot in front of him and filled his empty cup. Zhou Tong raised the wine pot and also filled his cup. Shui He raised his cup and said, "I hope that you die very slowly." Death was a very frightening matter, but if the process was fast enough, it could be called delightful. If it was very slow, then only pain would be left. Zhou Tong smiled, lightly clinked his cup with Shui He, and then brought it to his lips and drank. No matter how fast Chen Chongqing's sword is, it's impossible for him to get here so quickly. Zhou Tong's gaze once more turned to the stone wall that had quieted down. This was the most secretive and safest hiding place he had arranged for himself, yet he chose to abandon it without the slightest hesitation and find another place to hide. No matter how much Shui He hated this person, he had to admit that this kind of decisiveness was truly powerful to the extreme. At the same time, he was a bit curious and asked, "Although I don't know how heavy the snowstorm is today, I can imagine that there aren't many places in the capital that can guarantee your safety. Where can you go? Even a rabbit will leave 3 holes for escape, let alone humans like us." Zhou Tong said, You'll definitely feel regretful. It's really not easy for an evil person like me to die. At least, I won't die today." After saying this, he didn't say anything else. He walked out of the prison cell and followed the dim alley, heading towards an even darker place. The lights on both sides of the alley were similar to the dim light in his eyes. They were both ghostly fires. His figure gradually disappeared at the end of the alley, as if he was walking towards hell, until he sank into the deepest darkness. Separated by the iron bars, Shui silently gazed at Zhou Tong's back for a very long time. Even after Zhou Tong had disappeared, he was still gazing. It was not because he was sorrowful, nor was it because he truly did have some complex emotions in his heart. He just wanted to confirm that Zhou Tong had truly left. Water droplets once more fell from the stone ceiling, and then they scraped against the side walls. 2 hard stones were moved aside and a ball of mud was squeezed out. This was not true mud, but a person that had lived in the mud for several weeks. On the night of the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, Chen Chongqing had been brought to the Mausoleum of Books by the Divine Empress, Tang Tang had been brought back to Wenshui by the Tang's second master, and then Zhixiu had vanished. No one had ever discovered any trace of him again, not the Imperial Court, the Li Palace, or the Orthodox Academy. It turned out that he had been hiding in the alley of the Northern Military Department the entire time, just deep underground. If explained in detail, it would be very long and complicated, but it was actually very simple. The Department for Purging officials had replanted crabapple trees and dug a hole in the courtyard. He had jumped into this hole and remained underground until now. No one knew how he had managed to survive these several weeks. But to Zhixiu, this was a very normal matter. He was a wolf, possessing unimaginable patience and willpower. In order to catch prey, he could wait for a very long time, could endure hunger and thirst that humans could not. In order to kill the demon cavalry, he would often hide in the depths of the snow, hiding for several weeks at a time. Although snow was much softer than mud, it was also much colder. Zhou Tong was the strongest in his hunting experience, and he was also the prey that he most wanted to kill. Thus, he had expended even more patience, but of course, he had also paid no small price. His face was very pale and extremely gaunt. Although his eyes were still cold and focused, they were clearly much weaker than they were on the surface. Shui looked at him and asked, "Were you the one who activated the array?" "No, I don't understand arrays, nor did I know that Chen Chongqing would come." Zhixiu's voice was very hoarse, because he had drunk very little water in the last several weeks, and also because he had spoken very little. Shui thought back to the day when he had just been imprisoned in this deepest prison cell. The voice that came from the stone wall was very low and very hoarse. At the time, he did not know who was in the stone wall, whether it was a human or a ghost, but after hearing what it had to say, even if it really was a ghost, he would still cooperate with it. Shui extended his hand and pulled out the golden thorns from his blood-stained clothes. His brow creased, and he let out a painful grunt. 10 some golden thorns had been pulled out, but only a third of their true length. This was something that he and Zhixiu had prepared ahead of time. In the original plan, he wanted to cooperate with Zhixiu and think of a way to poison Zhou Tong. Then he would do his best to delay until Zhou Tong was poisoned. Zhixiu would break through the wall and join forces with him. At the start, reality had gone much more smoothly than imagined. The poisoning had been smoothly completed, but unexpectedly, someone had activated the array and frightened Zhou Tong away. It was very obvious that the person hiding in the shadows did not know of Zhixiu's existence, and of course, he did not know of Zhixiu's plan, but he still wanted Zhou Tong to die. Shui said, "Go notify Chen Chongqing. I'll go chase after Zhou Tong." Zhixiu did not object, but this did not mean that he tacitly agreed. It only meant that he would not listen to Shui's words. He gave a bunch of keys to Shui, walked out of the prison cell, and headed in the direction that Zhou Tong had disappeared. At the very beginning, he walked very slowly, because he was weak and also because he had been crawling through the mud for the past several dozen days. It had been a very long time since he had relied on his 2 feet to walk. It did not take long for his movements to become coordinated. Although they were still not very fast, they were stable enough. Zhou Tong walked through the gloomy alleyways. Every once in a while, he would make a turn, and from time to time, a door would fall down and then be covered up by the mud. The underground alleyways had always been as dense as a spider's web, and with this method, it had become incomparably complicated. He believed that even if someone helped Chen Chongqing break through the imperial court's encirclement and Chen Chongqing found the true location of Zhou prison and killed his way underground, he would still not be able to find him. This thought made him feel much more at ease, and he rubbed his chest. His brow creased, because he realized that his heart was beating rather fast. He didn't know if it was because he was walking too quickly, or if it was for some other reason, like fear. He was not willing to admit that he was afraid. He took a deep breath and began to circulate his true essence, preparing to calm his heartbeat. The true essence in his meridians flowed smoothly, just like water flowing in a canal suddenly meeting a bank that could not be crossed. His chest felt a sharp pain. He began to vomit blood. This blood was black. This is the second season of Week of Killing. When I wrote about the first season of Week of Killing, everyone knew from the chapter title that Zhou Tong would not have died at that time. I would have been extremely serious in killing him. Today is Christmas Eve, so I wish everyone a good time. However, I still have to say the most important thing, just like last year. Ladies, please pay attention to safety measures. Chapter 720. Zhou Tong stopped, his eyes narrowing. In the gloomy light of the lantern, he could still clearly see the color of the blood, as that blood was so black that it was somewhat dazzling. He could feel the heart beneath his palm beating faster and faster, causing his hand and arm to tremble. His shoulders also began to tremble, and then his entire body. His face became abnormally pale, as if he had suffered a serious illness in such a short amount of time. He had been poisoned, and it was a rare and powerful poison. The reason he had so quickly determined that this poison was very rare was because his department for purging officials was the place in the world most skilled at using poisons. He had personally seen and personally used more poisons than an ordinary person could eat in their entire lives. When had he been poisoned? He didn't know. A faint light flashed past his squinted eyes at high speed. Although there were no clues, he quickly determined who had poisoned him and when he had been poisoned. This didn't require any evidence. All he needed to do was to go back in time and have a grasp of some details. His assailant was probably still in his original position, but he did not turn around, because the first thing he needed to consider was how to leave. He took a handkerchief from his sleeve and wiped the filthy blood from the corner of his mouth. He continued forward, quickly vanishing into the darkness. After some time, a faint sound came from the darkness. The faint light of the lantern on the stone wall came back to life, reflecting Zheshio's pale face, his face stained with the traces of dried mud. He squatted down, dipped his hand in some of the filthy blood, and brought it to his nose to sniff. The black, dirty blood on the sharp, cold, knife-like fingers gave off a faint stench of blood. He was very satisfied. Following the scent, he quickly vanished into the darkness. The tunnels beneath the office of the Department for Purging Officials were as numerous and complex as a spider's web. Moreover, they were unimaginably long and could lead directly to very distant places. If it were possible, if it were any other time, Zhou Tong would normally stay underground for even longer, take even more detours, and set up even more mechanisms to ensure his absolute safety. But not today. He had already been poisoned. This poison was completely different from the poisons commonly used by the Department for Purging Officials. It did not specifically target his meridians, star orifices, or sea of consciousness. Instead, it was like a handful of sand pervading his internal organs, giving off a rough and even rough feeling. It even made him think of the vast plains of the north. This was something that was extremely close to nature, and even the sacred light technique might not be able to cure it. However, he was one of the few people in the world who were best at using poison. In this aspect, his ability could be called a great master. Even if he had never seen this kind of poison before, he knew where to start. To deal with this kind of poison, he could only use medicine, and it had to be herbal medicine. Even in Zhou prison, these herbs were very difficult to find. Fortunately, he knew of a place that was well prepared, and even more fortunate was that this was the place he had originally wanted to go. After walking through the damp, cold, and incomparably long alleyway, he didn't know how many turns he had made. The terrain was no longer flat, but slanted upwards. He continued to walk forward until he reached the end. His hands accurately reached into a gap in the wall, dispelling the formation, and then he turned on the mechanism. His hands pushed forward slightly, pushing open a door and leaving the darkness. A bright ray of sunlight was waiting for him outside the door, as well as a gentle and moving face. The sunlight came from the sky above the courtyard. The gloomy snow clouds had been blown away by the wind, revealing a porcelain blue sky. The warm winter sun appeared in his line of sight. The gentle and moving face belonged to a beautiful young woman. Upon seeing the sunlight and the young woman's face, Zhou Tong instantly felt his body warm up and much calmer. Moreover, the unconcealable worry and anxiety on the young woman's face made his chest heat up. This sort of emotion, completely different from fear and disgust, was what he lacked and needed the most in his life. The young woman helped him out of the tunnel, and then with some difficulty, she closed the tunnel and reactivated the mechanism. This courtyard was not large, nor could it be said to be exquisite, but whether it was the black eaves or the green bamboo railings, all the details exuded the word tranquility. When Zhou Tong had personally designed this courtyard, he had pursued this sort of thing. He had always believed that only tranquility had the taste of home. This courtyard was his home, his true home. It was the final resting place for his exhausted body and his heart that had been soaked in poison for countless years. Only by returning to this courtyard could he truly find peace, could he truly relax. For the sake of safety, for the sake of keeping this secret, for the sake of this rare peace and freedom from disturbance, Zhou Tong had very cautiously and carefully managed this courtyard. No one knew of this place, not the most loyal subordinates of the Department for Purging officials, not Qing Jun and the other 8 tigers, not even the Divine Empress. The only person who knew of the relationship between him and this courtyard was now dead. Every time he returned to this courtyard and heard the sounds coming from the neighboring courtyard through the green bamboo, Zhou Tong would always remember a few things. In these past few years, Xue Xingchuan had very much hoped that he could treat the Xue estate as his true home, but how could this be possible? Putting aside the fear and unease in the eyes of the servants and juniors of the Xue estate, just the fact that he was surnamed Zhou made it impossible. His elder brother did not want his surname, but he still wanted it. Other than the demon commander, Zhou Tong had probably killed the most people in the world. Perhaps for this reason, he was also most afraid of death. Besides this courtyard, he had several other secret bases in the capital, but to him, none of those places were as safe, as important, or as comfortable as this one. This was because this courtyard had a gentle and moving woman who truly respected and loved him. More importantly, he had hidden many precious objects here, like a few extremely rare herbs. A large portion of these herbs had been secretly obtained by people he had sent from the 100 Herb Garden, while a portion had been gifted to him by the Pavilion of Heavenly Secrets. He took the steaming towel and placed it over his face. Perhaps because the heat had irritated his lungs, he let out a few muffled coughs. When he took off the towel, it was already stained with several spots of black blood. It looked like flowers drawn in ink, unreal and rather frightening. The woman was very uneasy, but Zhou Tong seemed especially calm and unperturbed. He had her grind the ink while he sat on the chair, closing his eyes and meditating as if he was savoring something. He was savoring the poison in his body that carried the scent of the wilderness. After some time, he opened his eyes. With the woman's support, he walked to the desk in front of the window. Raising a brush, he began to write with great elegance and ease. The paper was dripping with ink, but the handwriting was extremely clear. It was not cursive, but a recipe. What herbs to use, how many bowls of water, how to boil it, what fire to use, what stove, what charcoal, what water, how to filter the medicine, when to add crystals, it was all very clear. The woman saw his expression and knew that he was probably fine. Relieved, she took the recipe and went to the back kitchen to boil the medicine. This sort of thing had happened several times before, and she had experienced it before. There was no mistake in the type or amount of herbs, and the way she lit the stove was very practiced. At some point, a beauty dressed in palace attire had appeared by the stove. The stove fire reddened her face, illuminating her incomparably beautiful face. This beauty was very beautiful. In truth, in the past few years, she had always been considered the most beautiful woman of the great Zhou dynasty. The woman calmly boiled the medicine, her movements of separating the herbs and filtering the dregs very steady. It was like she did not see the beauty. The beauty placed a few things into the pot. The woman still acted like she did not see it. The room was quiet, with only the gurgling of the soup in the pot. Chapter 7:21. The palace beauty walked to the window and silently gazed at the sunlight in the courtyard. The sunlight fell on her face, but it was unable to bring much warmth. Her beautiful brows and eyes always carried a coldness and haggardness that could not be erased. The kitchen was very quiet, the scene very strange. It slowly persisted and fermented in the sunlight. After some time, the medicine was finished. The woman held the pot with both hands and dipped it into the ice water prepared in the basin, waiting for the medicine to cool. Just like Zhou Tong, the palace beauty was also very skilled in mental technique. The woman could not see her by the window, most likely because she had been mesmerized by the illusion she had created. Ultimately, the woman raised her head and glanced at her, proving that all this was not an illusion, but reality. The palace beauty leaned against the window and lightly waved her hand, indicating that everything was proceeding as usual. The medicine could not be completely cooled before drinking, as this would more or less lose some of its medicinal strength. The bowl of medicine brought to Zhou Tong was still exuding a thick mist of heat. Zhou Tong was somewhat intoxicated by the heat brought by the mist. This sort of feeling filled him with vigor, but when he completely drank the medicine in the bowl, he was somewhat dissatisfied, because the medicine had scalded the roof of his mouth and gums. He did not blame the woman, but he was dissatisfied with his own attitude. He had been a little too hasty. Although he had not been scalded, he still felt somewhat uncomfortable. He used his tongue to lick it. A slightly sweet taste came from the tip of his tongue, somewhat like the taste of rust. He knew that this was the taste of blood and couldn't help but crease his brow. He took a mirror from the table and examined it. He found nothing strange, just that his gums were a little swollen and bleeding. The taste of blood gradually faded, leaving behind only the bitter taste of the medicine. He took 2 sugared peanuts from the plate and threw them into his mouth, carefully chewing them. Ever since he was very young, he had been very afraid of drinking medicine, because medicine was too bitter. Thus, every time he drank medicine, he would prepare a few sweet snacks in advance. As he chewed on the sugared peanuts, he thought about the matter he had encountered today. He had spent many years leading troops in the snowy plains of the north, so it was only natural that he could obtain this sort of poison. But just now, in the underground prison, how had he poisoned him? Did he want to poison him to avenge Xingchuan and make the world feel that this was the cycle of the heavens and retribution? The problem was that it wasn't that easy to poison himself. A sneer appeared at the corner of Zhou Tong's mouth, and there was an additional hint of pride in his cold eyes. The sugar-coated peanuts were delicious, but the only problem was that they stuck to his teeth. He took out a fine silver toothpick and picked his teeth as he continued to think. There was a high chance that he had already escaped Zhou prison, but that did not matter. Although the world was vast, there was no place for the Shui clan to hide. Zhou Tong's gaze passed through the window and landed on the neighboring courtyard. He thought to himself that after the matter was settled, he would capture he as soon as possible and then poison him to death, slowly poison him to death. He had already thought of which poisons to use to make he die the slowest and most painful death. A slight cracking sound rang in his mouth, interrupting his rambling and pleasurable thoughts at this time. One of his teeth was broken at the root, lying quietly in the palm of his hand. The broken stubble was covered in blood and stains, looking very sinister. Looking at this broken tooth, Zhou Tong's body, which had just warmed up not too long ago, once again turned cold. After a moment of silence, he picked up the mirror and looked at himself again. A single glance was enough to shake one's soul. His gums had already become a purple-black color, and his teeth were extremely loose. It seemed like a light gust of wind would cause them to fall off. The increasingly clear and unbearable pain coming from the broken tooth caused his body to once more tremble. He had only wanted to pick the sugar stains between his teeth, but he had ended up prying out a tooth. The front end of the exquisite silver toothpick had already turned completely black, like charcoal. It was a ghastly sight. All of this was an illusion, he said to himself. He was far too experienced in using poison. He was confident that his judgment was absolutely correct. Even if his method of detoxification could not completely purge the poison in his body, it could definitely temporarily suppress it. Then he would have a lot of time to slowly resolve this problem. But why was it that even though he had clearly drunk the medicine, the poison in his body had not been suppressed, and instead had become even more terrifying, already gnawing at his teeth? Zhou Tong could not understand and fell silent for a very long time. Even now, he still did not realize that although there was no problem with the medicine he had used, a problem might have occurred in the process of brewing it. He had never doubted the woman. He took out 2 precious pills, put them into his mouth, and swallowed them, temporarily suppressing the poison that was about to erupt. He felt a little dizzy and his vision a little blurry. If his vision had not been blurry, how could he have seen the woman walk to the gate of the small courtyard? The woman's arm was wrapped in a bundle made of blue floral cloth. The bundle was very small and simple, unable to hold too many things. Yes, of course it was. He had bought so many valuable things for her over the years, so how could such a small bundle possibly be able to hold it all? So she could not be preparing to leave, she could not be preparing to abandon him, it could not be that there was a problem with her, it could not be that she had poisoned him. Then his vision really had been blurry. This poison was truly too powerful, even causing him to hallucinate. Zhou Tong said to himself, then stood up from his chair. There was a distance of about 10 zhang between the room and the main gate, and the courtyard between them was filled with sunlight. He and the woman looked at each other, separated by a patch of sunlight. The woman's expression was calm, gentle, and peaceful. She bowed slightly, just like she always did when she bid farewell to him, but today she was the one bidding farewell. So all of this was not an illusion. Why? Zhou Tong did not ask, because he clearly knew that there were countless reasons for this, but since he had not realized it before, there was no need to realize it now. The cruelest thing in the world was that when you did not want to know the answer, someone just had to tell you the answer. She does not like you, has never liked you. The palace beauty walked to the gate and said to him, "She is only afraid of you, so she does not dare to leave." Why was she not afraid today? It was naturally because he was about to die. Zhou Tong was not surprised by her appearance. In truth, he was now completely confused. It was not that his medicine was ineffective, but that someone had added another poison to it. From the moment he understood this point, he knew that someone had come to this small courtyard, and he even knew who that person was. The person that understood you the most was naturally not your family, or else Xue Xingchuan would not have died so wretchedly, his corpse almost exposed in the wilderness. The person that understood you the most was also not necessarily your enemy, because you would always be on guard against your enemy, always make many preparations in advance. The person that understood you the most was also not necessarily your friend. Growing old together was very beautiful, but the two of you spent too little time together, the distance between the two cities too great. When you met, you would always drink, reminisce about the past, look forward to the future, bitterly curse your former teacher and the current imperial court. It was very rare for you to have a chance to discuss any of the finer details. Thus, the person that understood you the most was often your work partner. In working day after day for many years, it was very difficult for the two of you to not understand each other. You would drink together many times and talk about many details. Moreover, because of your relationship of hidden and overt competition, the two of you would remember these matters very clearly, preparing to use them at any time in the future. For example, he knew which restaurant you liked to eat the most, you knew which restaurant he liked to eat the most, he knew which leader you hated the most, you knew which channel he liked the most, he knew how many girlfriends you had over the years, you knew how many boats he had stepped on in the past month, and on the morning after Christmas Eve, the two of you might even come out of the same convenience hotel and smile at each other, because it was at this convenience hotel that the company could obtain the most suitable negotiated price. Logically speaking, Zhou Tong did not have any work partners, because the Department for Purging Officials was a very special yamen. It was directly responsible to the Tianhai Divine Empress, and did not need to interact with anyone in the imperial court. Qing Jun, the other 8 tigers, and the Redcoat Cavalry were all his subordinates, but there would always be a few rather special existences in the world, like this palace beauty. The Tianhai Divine Empress relied on divine generals like Xue Xingchuan, Tian Chui, and Su Shiji to control the great Zhou army, but her control over the imperial court and subsequent rule over the millions and millions of people of the great Zhou was primarily through 2 people. One was Zhou Tong, and the other was naturally Mou. They were the Tianhai Divine Empress's left and right arms in the imperial court, privately denounced by many as villains colluding in evil. They had worked together for many years, and although their minds could not be said to be connected, they had a tacit understanding. Whether facing the Tianhai clan or the powerful will of the military, this tacit understanding had always displayed a very positive effect. Because of this tacit understanding, they had a deep understanding of each other. Zhou Tong knew of the rebellious heart and unwillingness hidden in the depths of Mou's heart, and he even faintly sensed her thoughts about a certain person. Mou knew that he had very well concealed his fear of the Divine Empress and this small courtyard bathed in sunlight, so she had found this place today, and then delivered a fatal blow to him. Seeing Mou walk in from the door, Zhou Tong quickly calmed down, even faster than he had expected. In the days after the coup of the Mausoleum of Books, he had always had the Department for Purging Officials investigate, or perhaps confirm, her whereabouts in the south. Perhaps for this reason, he had actually long since mentally prepared himself to see her in the capital. He said to Mou, "I knew that you would definitely return to the capital, but I didn't expect it to be now." Mou asked why. Zhou Tong replied, "Since you know very well that if you return to the capital, you will definitely die." Mou looked at him and said, "I don't really care about this point, as long as you can definitely die before me." Zhou Tong did not know that Chen Chongqing had said something very similar not long ago. He looked at Mou and asked, "You've returned to avenge the Empress? I don't have this ability, and you are not my enemy, because you don't have the right." In Mou's view, he was just a dog raised by the Empress. "I've come to punish that dog in the Empress's place." Zhou Tong fell silent, then asked, "How are you prepared to punish this dog?" Mou replied, "Put it in a pot to stew? I think that's pretty good." Zhou Tong looked at her and very seriously said, You don't have to be that rabbit. It's not that I want to cook the dog when the rabbit is dead. It's just that I'm not as experienced in torturing people as you are, so I can only think of cooking you to death. Mo looked at him and very seriously asked, Do you have any other good suggestions?